Chapter 8 Insulin Resistance, Your Brain's Silent Enemy. Wouldn't it be nice if the human body had an early alert system that advised us when something was about to go wrong with our health? Prediabetes offers a warning and gives us a chance to change the future. Diabetes Canada. The road to metabolic ruin is long, slow, and seemingly silent. So silent that most families who experience health crises feel they've been ambushed by a tragedy they never saw coming. Mothers in their 40s learning they have breast cancer. Husbands in their 50s dying from heart attacks. Grandparents in their 70s absorbing the dreaded diagnosis of early Alzheimer's disease. When families share the devastating news about their loved ones, the phrase I hear most often is, "But I don't understand why this happened. They were so healthy." They'll then list signs of good health. Mom is a strict vegetarian who walks religiously every day. My husband biked 100 miles a week and his cholesterol was perfect. Grandma is active in her community and does crossword puzzles every morning to keep her brain sharp. She just had her annual physical and everything was completely normal. Families and medical professionals alike chalk these catastrophes up to genes, age, or bad luck. But what all of these conditions have in common is insulin resistance, a metabolic disease most people have never heard of, most doctors don't test for, and most of us already have. Insulin resistance has reached epidemic proportions in the United States and in many other countries around the world. According to the Centers for Disease Control, 96 million Americans have insulin resistance, and 78 million of them don't know it. Another 37 million Americans have full-blown type 2 diabetes, which is a severe advanced stage of insulin resistance. Taken together, these statistics tell us that 52% of Americans have a significant degree of metabolic dysfunction. The United States outpaces most other nations in this regard, but the sad truth is that metabolic health is on the decline everywhere in the world. 17% of Australians, 19% of Canadians, 25% of New Zealanders, and 27% of people living in the UK have insulin resistance. And these statistics don't even include those with type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance develops gradually and has usually already been present for many years before tragedy strikes. Unfortunately, there's no single test for insulin resistance, so we have to diagnose it in roundabout ways, but it's easy to find if you know what to look for. In this chapter, I'll show you how to evaluate yourself for insulin resistance using simple measurements you can do at home and simple blood tests you've probably already had. Once you learn to recognize the telltale signs of insulin resistance, you'll be able to see most medical tragedies, including those of a psychiatric nature, coming from a mile away. And more importantly, you can take action to prevent them. Phase 1. Metabolic instability. In the early stages of metabolic dysfunction, instability is the name of the game. Whenever your sugary diet tries to drive your blood glucose up too high, your pancreas releases as much insulin as it takes to pull it back down again. How does insulin accomplish this? It binds to receptors on muscle and fat cells, and those cells respond by pulling glucose out of your circulation. Insulin also binds to receptors in the liver, signaling them to stop releasing glucose into the bloodstream. For a while, these cells respond dutifully to insulin's instructions, keeping your glucose in a healthy range. Phase 2. High insulin levels, non-diabetes glucose levels. However, if you continue to eat in an unhealthy way, you'll be repeatedly bombarding your cells with insulin, which puts tremendous pressure on your insulin signaling system. Our cells simply weren't designed to absorb and process large quantities of glucose multiple times per day. To pace themselves and protect themselves from overstimulation, your cells push back and become increasingly resistant to insulin's instructions. Over time, a vicious cycle takes hold. The more resistant your cells become, the more insulin it takes to overcome that resistance, and the longer it takes to bring your glucose back down to normal. During this intermediate stage of metabolic malfunction, high insulin is the name of the game. Instead of quickly going up and then right back down again, insulin goes up higher and stays up longer. As the disease progresses, insulin may need to remain high virtually all the time to cope with incoming glucose loads. This stage of metabolic dysfunction is insulin resistance. Insulin resistance goes by several names, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. Prediabetes is commonly used because insulin resistance often, but not always, leads to type 2 diabetes. Metabolic syndrome refers to a cluster of familiar health problems that often go hand in hand with insulin resistance. Increased belly fat, slightly elevated fasting blood glucose, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, blood fats, and low HDL cholesterol, the so-called good cholesterol. Refer to Chapter 11 for more information about cholesterol. There is more than one official definition of metabolic syndrome, but the most commonly used diagnostic criteria are the following. Your fasting blood glucose is between 111 and 125 milligrams per deciliter, or you are taking medication for high blood glucose. If your fasting blood glucose is higher than 125 milligrams per deciliter, then you have type 2 diabetes. Your blood pressure is higher than 130 over 85, or you are taking blood pressure medications. Your fasting triglycerides are 150 milligrams per deciliter or higher. Your HDL cholesterol is below 40 milligrams per deciliter if you are a man, or below 50 milligrams per deciliter if you are a woman. And your waist circumference is greater than 40 inches if you are a man, and greater than 35 inches if you are a woman. Do any of these apply to you? Even though the official diagnosis of metabolic syndrome requires that you have at least 3 of these, every one of them is a sign of poor metabolic health, so your goal should be to get as close to 0 as you can. Insulin resistance is the term I chose to use throughout this audiobook, but it has its shortcomings as well. The first is that it suggests that insulin resistance itself is the primary problem, when in reality, insulin resistance begins as a healthy reaction to an unhealthy situation, insulin levels that are too high. Overexposure to any hormone will naturally result in hormone resistance. Another point of confusion is that there are times when the body is programmed to produce more insulin than usual and become insulin resistant on purpose to allow glucose to be redistributed in special ways, such as during puberty and during pregnancy. This is called physiological insulin resistance, and it is completely healthy and normal. Hyperinsulinemia, or high blood insulin, is perhaps the most accurate term for insulin resistance. Unfortunately, this term isn't very user-friendly, but it gets right to the root of the problem because high insulin levels are what cause insulin resistance in the first place. Phase 3. Type 2 diabetes and most other health catastrophes. Type 2 diabetes occurs when the vicious cycle of climbing insulin levels and worsening insulin resistance eventually damages your metabolism to the degree that even persistently high levels of insulin can't bring your blood glucose back down to normal, not even after fasting all night long. As mentioned, When your fasting blood glucose rises above 125 milligrams per deciliter, you officially have type 2 diabetes. Insulin resistance is sometimes called prediabetes because every year, 10% of people with insulin resistance will progress to type 2 diabetes if they don't change course. But type 2 diabetes is just the tip of the iceberg because persistently high insulin levels and insulin resistance secretly set the stage for most of the diseases we dread. It would therefore be just as accurate to think of insulin resistance as pre-fatty liver, pre-obesity, or pre-heart attack. Insulin resistance either instigates or aggravates all of the following conditions. Non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Insulin tells the liver to turn excess glucose into fat. 98% of people with non-alcoholic fatty liver disease have insulin resistance. Tinnitus, vertigo, and hearing loss. High insulin levels disrupt electrical signaling in the ear. More than 90% of people with inner ear problems, such as tinnitus, vertigo, and hearing loss, have high insulin levels. Coronary artery disease. High insulin promotes high blood pressure and inflammation of the coronary arteries. It also impairs their ability to relax. At least 3/4 of people with coronary artery disease have insulin resistance. Obesity. High insulin tells fat cells to stop burning fat. More than 90% of people with obesity have insulin resistance. Gallbladder disease. High insulin tells the liver to overproduce cholesterol, thickening the bile. Breast cancer. High insulin tells breast cells to grow and multiply more than they should. Colon cancer. High insulin tells colon cells to grow and multiply more than they should. Polycystic ovarian syndrome and infertility. High insulin levels raise testosterone levels in the ovaries. 70% of women with polycystic ovarian syndrome have insulin resistance. Prostate enlargement. The higher the fasting insulin, the faster the prostate grows. Erectile dysfunction. Insulin resistance impairs the ability of blood vessels in the penis to relax and dilate. More than 50% of men with erectile dysfunction have insulin resistance. Stroke. High insulin levels promote blood clot formation and make it harder for blood vessels to relax and dilate. High blood pressure. Insulin tells kidneys to retain sodium and water. 50% of people with high blood pressure have insulin resistance. And acne. High insulin levels raise levels of androgens, hormones that tell pores to overproduce an oily, waxy substance called sebum. About 3/4 of people with acne have insulin resistance. The higher the insulin level, the more severe the acne. A table of these conditions can be found in the accompanying PDF. Some of these conditions have become so common that we think of them as a normal part of getting older. But many of these conditions are driven more by insulin resistance than by age. Do you have any of these conditions? If so, you may have insulin resistance, and the more of these conditions you have, the more likely it is. As you can see, insulin resistance itself is a dangerous metabolic disease, whether it ever progresses to type 2 diabetes or not. Yet, 4 out of 5 Americans who have this hazardous condition don't know they have it. How can that be? Unfortunately, most doctors don't look for insulin resistance. Instead, they look for full-blown diabetes by ordering a fasting blood glucose or a hemoglobin A1C, a test that reflects your average blood glucose over the past 3 months. The problem with this approach is that both of these glucose tests can look perfectly normal even if you have had insulin resistance for many years. Remember, people with insulin resistance have high insulin levels, and all that extra insulin keeps glucose levels under control until it can't. That means that fasting glucose is the last domino to fall. We think of type 2 diabetes as a glucose problem, but it begins as an insulin problem that gradually worsens over time. It can take up to 20 years for insulin resistance to progress to type 2 diabetes. This is why a much better test for metabolic dysfunction is a fasting insulin level. This inexpensive blood test tells you how much insulin your pancreas has to produce to keep your glucose in check. I test all of my patients for insulin resistance, and I train other psychiatric professionals to do the same, because it provides insight into brain metabolism that a standard psychiatric interview cannot. Testing is essential because traits we think of as hallmarks of good health, such as youth and physical fitness, do not protect people from insulin resistance. Children, slender people, even elite athletes can have insulin resistance, which is why so many seemingly healthy people go undiagnosed until it's too late. We have known for decades how dangerous glucose and insulin regulation problems are for our physical health, but we have only recently begun to piece together that our mental health is just as vulnerable to these metabolic disturbances, if not more so, because the brain is so exquisitely sensitive to fluctuations in fuel supply. The scientific exploration of the connection between metabolic problems and most psychiatric problems is still in its infancy, except when it comes to Alzheimer's disease. A robust body of research has produced multiple lines of high-quality evidence detailing the relationship between insulin resistance and Alzheimer's disease, and the verdict is in. Insulin resistance is a key driving force behind most cases of Alzheimer's disease. Do you have insulin resistance? There is no single direct test for insulin resistance, so doctors use a combination of other tests to estimate where you stand on the insulin resistance spectrum. You'll find a complete list of insulin resistance tests and their healthy ranges in your accompanying PDF. You don't need every test on the list. Just choose a few that you've already had or that are easiest for you to obtain. The simplest and most common tests used are fasting insulin, fasting lipids, cholesterol and triglycerides, waist-to-height ratio, and fasting glucose. If you've had any of those tests in the past 6 months or so, and you haven't made any significant changes to your lifestyle since then, you can probably use the results from those tests. If not, ask your doctor to order them for you, or you can order tests yourself. See Chapter 17. Learning from Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease robs 1 in 10 Americans over the age of 65 of their dignity and humanity by slowly eroding their intellectual, emotional, and physical capabilities. More than 6 million Americans suffer from Alzheimer's disease today, and this number is expected to more than double by the year 2050, taking an enormous toll on the hearts, minds, and wallets of individuals, families, and communities. And while Americans may lead the way, Americans are not alone. At 55 million patients and counting, Alzheimer's is now the most common neurodegenerative disease in the world. Sadly, we are all intimately familiar with the contours of this disease. First come forgetfulness, word-finding problems, and occasional mild confusion. Increasingly, everyday tasks become challenging, and clouds of depression, irritability, or suspiciousness may roll in. As the disease marches on, the ability to recognize beloved faces wanes. Serious psychiatric symptoms, including paranoia, and even hallucinations may emerge, and bodily functions as basic as swallowing eventually become impossible. How is it that a single illness can cause such a staggering variety of disabling symptoms? Most people think of Alzheimer's as a memory disease, but in fact, Alzheimer's is a neurodegenerative disease that cripples and kills not just memory-making cells, but many other brain cells as well, eventually leading to the widespread disintegration of the brain. We feel hopeless in the face of Alzheimer's disease because we're told that nobody knows what causes it and that no good treatments exist. According to the Alzheimer's Association, Alzheimer's disease is the only disease in the top 10 causes of death in the United States that cannot be prevented, slowed, or cured. Until recently, despite thousands of clinical trials conducted over 4 decades and costing billions of dollars, not a single medicine had emerged that could provide meaningful relief of symptoms, let alone alter the course of the illness. This dismal track record has led several major companies to scale back or entirely abandon their Alzheimer's drug development programs. It was against this backdrop of failure and hopelessness that the pharmaceutical company Biogen cajoled the FDA in 2021 into fast-tracking approval for a brand new monoclonal antibody treatment for Alzheimer's disease called aducanumab, and a sister medication called lecanemab was approved in 2022. These controversial intravenous drugs cost tens of thousands of dollars per year, offer barely perceptible improvements in cognitive test scores, and come with a significant risk of brain bleeding and swelling. Experts tell us that the major risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, age, genetics, and family history, lie completely beyond our control. Messages like these make us feel like sitting ducks, simply waiting around to see whether Alzheimer's disease will strike us next. The little-known truth is that scientists now understand a great deal about what lays the groundwork for most cases of Alzheimer's disease, more than enough to confidently conclude that this scourge may be largely preventable. Is Alzheimer's disease a modern malady? We can't travel back in time to study the brains of our ancestors from centuries past, but written records tell us that prior to the 1900s, descriptions of Alzheimer's and similar forms of dementia are hard to find, suggesting that this vicious disease may be a relatively new phenomenon. In fact, the very origin of the word dementia dates back only to the early 1800s. In 1906, when German psychiatrist Dr. Alois Alzheimer first described the disease that bears his name, the condition was considered extremely rare. Little did he know that a century later, his name would become a household word. Alzheimer's disease has become so commonplace that most of us think of it as a normal part of the aging process. But consider this. 1/3 of Americans over the age of 85 falls prey to this ruthless condition, which means that 2/3 do not. We all know people over 85 with razor-sharp minds who lead rich, fulfilling lives. To this day, my 90-year-old mother works full-time caring for adults with developmental disabilities, keeping track of their appointments, medications, food preferences, social calendars, and countless other important details. She knows all the best local driving shortcuts, has a quick wit, and a zest for life. The fact that the majority of the oldest old members of society are spared dementia makes it plain that Alzheimer's disease is not part of the normal aging process. This then begs the question, why is it that some brains deteriorate with age while other brains thrive? Insulin resistance is pre-Alzheimer's disease. For decades, scientists hunted for the answer to this fundamental question. Then, In 2005, Brown University neuroscientist Dr. Suzanne de Lamont published a groundbreaking paper proposing a fresh new theory about the origins of Alzheimer's dementia. Alzheimer's disease may represent a neuroendocrine disorder that resembles, yet is distinct from, diabetes mellitus. Therefore, we propose the term type 3 diabetes to reflect this newly identified pathogenic mechanism of neurodegeneration. Cited by nearly 2,000 scientific publications since, this important paper continues to inspire new studies around the world, contributing to a growing body of scientific knowledge that supports Dr. de Lamont's pioneering insights. Understanding that the destruction of our most precious organ is driven in large part by blood sugar and insulin regulation problems we already know how to manage, represents a profound paradigm shift in the field and ushers in an exciting new era of Alzheimer's disease prevention. A staggering 81% of people with Alzheimer's disease have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, a rate twice as high as that of their cognitively healthy peers. Furthermore, the younger you are when you are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, the greater your risk of developing Alzheimer's as you age. The term type 3 diabetes is catching on because it summarizes in 3 words the powerful connection between 2 of the most common and most dreaded diseases we face, type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's disease, both of which are driven by insulin resistance. Insulin resistance and the brain. Recall that brain glucose levels mirror blood glucose levels. So, the higher your blood sugar, the higher your brain sugar. With insulin and the brain, it's a different story. In those of us with persistently high blood insulin levels, the receptors responsible for escorting insulin across the blood-brain barrier can become increasingly resistant to insulin, making it harder and harder for insulin to penetrate the brain. Therefore, over time, as counterintuitive as it sounds, the higher your blood insulin, the lower your brain insulin. Low brain insulin is a serious problem because without insulin, brain cells can't process glucose and turn it into the energy and components they need to thrive. Cells deprived of adequate insulin can't utilize glucose at full capacity. So, instead of flourishing, they sputter and struggle to maintain normal operations. This dire predicament is called cerebral glucose hypometabolism, sluggish brain glucose processing. This brain energy slowdown can be detected with a PET scan, a positron emission tomography scan, a technique that generates 3-dimensional images of the brain's glucose usage patterns. These scans cost thousands of dollars and are not usually covered by insurance. PET scan studies conclusively show that the more insulin resistant you are, the less glucose your brain can utilize. Your brain will still absorb plenty of glucose, but it will become increasingly difficult for it to absorb enough insulin to process that glucose. If your brain has become insulin resistant, it can be swimming in a sea of glucose and still be starving to death. The hungry hippocampus. Which brain cells are among the first to suffer the consequences of an insulin shortage? The cells of the hippocampus, your brain's learning and memory center. The hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped mini organ buried deep inside your brain with special properties that make it particularly vulnerable to insulin resistance. Whenever you're learning something for the first time, memory cells inside the hippocampus sprout tiny new dendritic spines to connect with neighboring cells and build new circuits. You may recall that this remarkable ability of the brain to remodel itself in response to our experiences is called neuroplasticity. As a master growth hormone, insulin is crucial to the process of dendritic spine formation, growth, and survival. The hippocampus also possesses the rare ability to give birth to brand new brain cells, yet another growth process that requires insulin. Hippocampal cells need so much energy to do their important work that they often require extra boosts of glucose. These special glucose surges require insulin, making the hippocampus even more prone to problems than other areas of the brain when insulin is in short supply. If there isn't enough insulin in your brain to supercharge your hippocampus, or if your hippocampus isn't responding normally to insulin signals, recording new memories will be challenging. This helps to explain why short-term memory problems are among the earliest signs of this disease. For people with Alzheimer's dementia, learning new information or recalling recent events is much harder than remembering things that happened a long time ago. Without access to adequate insulin, the hungry hippocampus struggles to chronicle new memories, and its cells begin to shrivel and die. Hippocampal atrophy, shrinkage of the hippocampus, is an ominous harbinger of Alzheimer's disease. By the time a person headed for Alzheimer's disease notices memory problems, the hippocampus has already shrunk by more than 10%. Plaques and tangles, smoking guns, or red herrings. Sadly, the fundamental role insulin resistance plays in the development of Alzheimer's disease remains underappreciated. Instead, many experts, institutions, and organizations continue to devote most of their time and resources to flashier elements of the disorder, amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. This fixation began in 1906, when a woman by the name of Auguste Deter died in a hospital in Frankfurt, Germany, after suffering for 5 long years with severe progressive paranoia and confusion. The origin of her symptoms being a mystery, the hospital director sent brain specimens from Frau Deter's autopsy to Dr. Alzheimer in Munich for examination. Dr. Alzheimer was a neuropathology expert who had spent many years studying and writing about brain anatomy. So, when he scrutinized Frau Deter's brain under the microscope and saw the 2 peculiar protein formations that we now refer to as amyloid plaques and neurofibrillary tangles, he knew these were new and important discoveries. In the long hunt for treatable root causes of dementia, these plaques and tangles have remained the focus of intense scientific curiosity and research. And many investigators continue to believe these oddities drive the development of dementia. As you'll see, while they may play some role in the course of the disease, it's becoming clear they are not in the driver's seat. Amyloid plaques. Under stress, brain cells release protein fragments called amyloid peptides to help defend themselves. So amyloid itself is good. However, if these fragments clump together into amyloid plaques, they can interfere with brain cell signaling, but they do not appear to be the root cause of Alzheimer's disease. 40% of people over age 80 are walking around with amyloid plaques in their brains, yet have not a whiff of cognitive impairment. Furthermore, researchers have spent decades of time and billions of dollars studying amyloid and designing drugs to attack it, yet, with the dubious exception of the new monoclonal antibody treatments, every single one of these drugs has failed in clinical trials. It appears that the insulin-resistant brain may be fertile ground for plaque development. As a hormone intimately involved in growth and repair, insulin stimulates production of insulin-degrading enzyme, which not only breaks down used insulin molecules, but helps clear away excess amyloid molecules as well. People with low brain insulin therefore have lower levels of this enzyme, making it easier for excess amyloid to clump into plaques. In this way, maintaining healthy levels of brain insulin may help protect against plaque formation in the first place. Neurofibrillary tangles. Some scientists who have lost faith in the amyloid hypothesis have turned their attention to the tantalizing possibility that neurofibrillary tangles might be more to blame for the brain's descent into dementia. Neurofibrillary tangles are also big abnormal clumps of protein, tau proteins to be exact. Tau is a housekeeping molecule that helps maintain cell infrastructure. When tau proteins abandon their posts, they can band together and form large, dysfunctional, flame-shaped tangles that accumulate inside cells, disrupting normal brain cell architecture. Tau tangles can wreak such havoc that some cells may ultimately decide to commit apoptosis, cellular suicide. People are more likely to experience cognitive problems if they have tangles than if they have plaques. So it is understandable that some scientists find them attractive as potential Alzheimer's disease culprits. But again, before we become obsessed with tangle removal, it is worth stopping first to wonder what prompts tau proteins to gang up on the very cells they are supposed to be taking care of. In the healthy brain, insulin works to keep tau proteins at their stations, maintaining order. However, when insulin is in short supply, tau proteins desert their stations and accumulate into toxic heaps. This is just one more way in which insulin deficiency in the brain helps set the stage for neurodegeneration and cell death. Guilt by association? The tau hypothesis has taken off like a rocket, but some scientists caution that the tau theory may be yet another red herring, distracting us from the true underlying causes of Alzheimer's disease. It is beginning to look like the tale of tau may mirror not only amyloid's story, but also the stories of other well-meaning proteins unfairly blamed for the neurodegenerative diseases they happen to be associated with. Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, Huntington's disease, and Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, all sport curious clumps of signature proteins that have captured the imagination of pharmaceutical researchers, luring them into careers spent aiming their talents at the wrong targets. The human body is intelligently designed. Everything it does for a reason. Does the aging brain purposefully churn out toxic, dysfunctional proteins to hasten its own demise? Unlikely. In a 2019 review of the evidence, scientists from New Zealand's University of Canterbury Mental Health and Nutrition Research Group pointed to problems with brain metabolism as the most likely driver of plaques, tangles, and the progression of Alzheimer's disease. Neurotransmitter problems, acetylcholine, and glutamate. In addition to filling up with plaques and tangles, the Alzheimer's brain suffers from imbalances in neurotransmitters important to memory function. One hallmark of Alzheimer's disease is the gradual disappearance of brain cells that produce acetylcholine. When this problem was first identified in the 1970s, it was considered a revolutionary breakthrough in Alzheimer's research and led to the development of drugs designed to prolong the activity of the dwindling amounts of acetylcholine the brain was still able to produce. However, these medicines, donepezil, Aricept, rivastigmine, Exelon, and galantamine, Razidine, can't bring back the cells that have already vanished, and they are powerless to prevent the ongoing destruction of the acetylcholine-producing cells that remain. What is killing these precious cells? Tau and amyloid accumulation are partly to blame, but low brain insulin activity contributes to their demise by reducing the supply of nerve growth factor, a nurturing protein these cells need in order to thrive. The other commonly prescribed drug that may provide some support for the Alzheimer's brain is memantine or Namenda, a medicine that tones down the activity of glutamate, a neurotransmitter that can spin out of control in Alzheimer's disease. The process of neuroplasticity requires fine-tuning of glutamate to get the levels just right. Too little glutamate shifts the brain into neutral, bringing construction and maintenance of new synapses to a halt. But too much glutamate shifts the brain into a toxic state of overdrive, fueling the inflammation and oxidative stress that directly contribute to the widespread neurodegeneration we see in Alzheimer's disease. Insulin resistance contributes to this problem both by interfering with healthy glutamate metabolism and function and by promoting amyloid and tau buildup. Amyloid plaques and tau tangles can damage the glutamate regulation system over time and allow glutamate to reach dangerously high levels that are capable of triggering cell death. Are you already on the road to Alzheimer's disease? Just as type 2 diabetes doesn't happen overnight, neither does Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is quietly preceded by decades of dwindling brain glucose metabolism. Sluggish brain glucose processing has been documented in people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s who have no cognitive symptoms at all. In fact, your brain can lose up to a quarter of its total glucose processing power before you notice any problems with your memory. Researchers have even found PET scan evidence of brain glucose processing problems in insulin-resistant women in their early 20s, who also reported no cognitive issues. Yet deep inside their brains, unbeknownst to them, glucose processing is slowing down, plaques and tangles are accumulating, neurons are malfunctioning, and the hippocampus is silently shrinking. The realization that dementia develops so stealthily prompted the National Institute on Aging and the Alzheimer's Association to create a new diagnostic system in 2011 that now includes 2 new preclinical, symptom-free stages, which can only be detected by brain imaging, PET scan or MRI, or lumbar puncture, spinal tap. But these are expensive, invasive tests that are not available to most people. Fortunately, there is a much simpler and more empowering tool at your disposal that can provide insight into your brain's metabolism. You can evaluate yourself for insulin resistance. Just as you can't afford to wait until your fasting glucose becomes abnormal to think about type 2 diabetes, you can't afford to wait until you reach a certain age or notice memory problems to think about Alzheimer's. The good news is that this slow downhill slide in brain power has much more to do with your metabolic health than with your age, your amyloid levels, or your ancestry. Meaning, you have the power to influence the course of your intellectual future by changing your diet. Is insulin resistance pre-mental illness? Decades of careful Alzheimer's research has taught us this. The fundamental problem that insulin resistance creates for the brain is restricted access to energy. We still have a lot to learn about how insulin resistance influences psychiatric conditions other than Alzheimer's disease, but it stands to reason that an energy shortage could make it more difficult for the brain to control mood, thinking, and behavior, and emerging evidence supports this idea. Signs of insulin resistance are strongly associated with psychiatric disorders. That is to say, people with insulin resistance are much more likely to suffer poor mental health and vice versa. For example, people with glucose levels in the pre-diabetes range are 2.7 times more likely to develop major depression than people with normal glucose levels. People with newly diagnosed bipolar disorder are 3.5 times more likely to have metabolic syndrome than their peers without bipolar disorder. People with newly diagnosed schizophrenia are 3.7 times more likely to have insulin resistance than their peers without schizophrenia. Did you notice the size of these associations? You may recall from Chapter 3 that for an association between any two things to be meaningful, it should be at least 2.0. These associations all fall above this threshold. They still can't tell us whether metabolic problems cause these mental health conditions, but they are strong enough to tell us that the relationship between the two may be more than just a coincidence. A causal relationship between the two is plausible. Given everything Alzheimer's research has taught us about how insulin resistance disrupts normal brain structure and function, it would be surprising to me if insulin resistance didn't have the potential to cause other mental health disorders, or at least to play a significant role in their origin or severity. People with Alzheimer's disease often suffer from symptoms that look identical to those of major mental illnesses such as depression, mood swings, anxiety, paranoia, hallucinations, and insomnia. When symptoms such as these appear in young people without Alzheimer's, could they be early warning signs of brain degeneration? In other words, could brain energy deficits be the root cause, or at least a contributing cause, of psychiatric disorders other than Alzheimer's disease? We've known for a very long time that depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia are chronic illnesses that can worsen over the years and even lead to cognitive decline. PET scans of depressed patients who don't respond to antidepressants show pronounced slowing in brain glucose processing when compared to patients who improve on antidepressants. Furthermore, a large multinational study found that people with depression had, on average, a 24% reduction in the size of the hippocampus, the same brain region notorious for shrinking in Alzheimer's disease, which may help to explain why depression doubles your risk for developing dementia later in life. Stanford University psychiatrist Dr. Natalie Razgon was the first to notice that insulin resistance could be the missing link between these two common conditions, writing in 2005, "Insulin resistance may be an important therapeutic target for effective management of depressive disorders and possibly prevention of Alzheimer's disease." In bipolar disorder, some brain areas process glucose better than others, but overall, there is a reduction in glucose usage compared to people without bipolar disorder. Hippocampus size is also smaller, and having a diagnosis of bipolar disorder more than doubles your chances of developing dementia later in life. In people with schizophrenia, who also have insulin resistance, brain cells process glucose more slowly, causing glucose to accumulate to higher levels inside the brain. This group of people also performs less well on memory tests than those without insulin resistance. Hippocampus size is also smaller in people with schizophrenia, and people with schizophrenia are 2.5 times more likely to be diagnosed with dementia as they age. Researchers have also detected sluggish brain glucose processing in adults who have had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, since childhood, people with borderline personality disorder, and people with OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, who have hoarding behaviors. Given that insulin resistance and compromised brain glucose processing are features of so many different psychiatric conditions, it would make sense to offer patients treatment options capable of addressing these head-on. Beyond association, insulin resistance and bipolar disorder. Dr. Cynthia Kelkin, a metabolic psychiatrist at Dalhousie University, is the first researcher to put this association to the test in a randomized controlled trial. In 2015, she observed that her patients with bipolar disorder, who also happened to have insulin resistance or type 2 diabetes, were more likely to have chronic mood symptoms, more likely to experience rapid cycling mood patterns, and less likely to respond to lithium, a mood-stabilizing medication. She then designed a sophisticated experimental protocol to explore whether reversing insulin resistance using metformin, a medicine commonly prescribed for type 2 diabetes, could help people with long-standing bipolar disorder who had tried multiple psychiatric medications without relief. The results of her study, published in 2022, were striking. Reversal of insulin resistance substantially improved depression symptoms in every case. When I asked Dr. Kalkin what it felt like to witness these outcomes, she said, almost 90% of the patients in this study had not had a single remission in 25 years. It has been a relief to discover a new mechanism-based treatment that can get these patients better. In an interview with the CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Kelly Williams, a Nova Scotia resident who participated in the study, shared her experience. My depression felt like if someone had passed away. There were some times, several times, where I contemplated suicide. To try and get rid of that despair or pain I felt, I actually started cutting as well, just to try and redirect that pain you feel inside your head. After reversal of her insulin resistance, a condition she didn't know she had until Dr. Kalkin tested her for it, her depression went away. I couldn't believe it was actually gone, Williams added. I'd never felt such a sense of wellness in my life. This is truly a miracle. If reversing insulin resistance with a simple diabetes medication helps people with bipolar disorder feel better, it would be reasonable to think that reversing insulin resistance with lifestyle changes could do the same. One of the most effective ways to address insulin resistance is with a ketogenic diet. And in the next chapter, you will see how much promise this intervention holds, not only for the treatment of bipolar disorder, but for the treatment of many other psychiatric conditions as well. Piecing the puzzle together. If you have insulin resistance and you eat in an unhealthy way, your brain glucose levels will be unstable, your brain insulin activity will be low, and your brain will struggle to produce energy. Excess glucose sugarcoats vital brain molecules, setting off waves of inflammation and oxidative stress that your low insulin brain lacks the power and materials to fight. Without the resources it needs to neutralize oxidative stress and heal inflammation, your brain's fragile landscape could continue to smolder indefinitely. How exactly will chronic inflammation, oxidative stress, and sluggish brain glucose processing affect your mental health? I believe this is where genetics, family history, early life nutrition, environmental exposures, and life experiences come into play. Whether you develop mood, concentration, anxiety, social, behavioral, or memory problems, or some combination of these, may depend largely on the biological cards you have been dealt and how you have lived your life to this point. But take heart. No matter what your past looks like or what your vulnerabilities may be, you have it within your power to fundamentally change the way your brain does business, and that could make all the difference. Chapter 9. The Promise of Ketogenic Diets for Mental Health. I'm convinced that nutritional measures can have a profound impact and lead to very important benefits, which makes me say that this represents the future direction to develop in psychiatric care. Albert Denon, MD. Several years ago, a young man with epilepsy and autism behaviors adopted a ketogenic diet and experienced substantial improvements in both conditions within only a few weeks, ultimately becoming seizure-free. It just so happened that this young man was a relative of my friend and colleague, Dr. Albert Donat, who has been practicing psychiatry in Toulouse, France for more than 35 years. Having witnessed this remarkable transformation in brain health in a member of his own family, Dr. Donat became curious about whether this same diet might be able to help some of his own patients. The population Dr. Donat serves is comprised primarily of people of French and North African descent with severe mental illnesses, most of whom he has been working closely with for many years or even decades. He invited 31 of his most treatment-resistant patients with major depression, bipolar disorder, or schizoaffective disorder, a form of schizophrenia which also affects mood, to try a ketogenic diet under his close supervision in the Clinique du Castelvieil, a local psychiatric hospital. As is so often the case in people with chronic mental illness, all of these volunteers also had markers of poor metabolic health, such as high blood glucose, high blood pressure, high triglycerides, and obesity. Many were unable to work due to psychiatric disability. All of them were taking multiple psychiatric medications, and all of them had been hospitalized before by Dr. Donat one or more times at either the Clinique du Castelvieil or at a similar sister hospital nearby. Having exhausted all other treatment options, they agreed to participate. What happened was extraordinary. By week 3, every one of the volunteers who stuck with the plan, 28 of the original 31, began improving, both metabolically and psychiatrically. All 23 people with depression symptoms experienced substantial improvements in mood, and all 10 people with schizoaffective disorder experienced substantial reductions in psychosis symptoms. 12 people, 44%, achieved full clinical remission, and 18 people were discharged from the hospital on less psychiatric medication than they were taking at the time of admission. All but one patient lost weight, despite the fact that nearly all were taking antipsychotic medications, which are notorious for causing stubborn weight gain. The dietary prescription used in this study was adapted from the protocol that one of our co-authors, Dr. Eric Westman, has used in his weight loss research at Duke University for many years. The plan consisted almost exclusively of meat, seafood, poultry, eggs, vegetables, nuts, and cheese. It was low in carbohydrate, 20 grams per day maximum, and moderate in protein, 15 to 20% of calories, with the remainder of daily calorie requirements coming from fat. The diet was well tolerated, and no medical or psychiatric safety issues arose. You can find a copy of Dr. Donat's diet protocol in the accompanying PDF. These outcomes were so unexpected that Dr. Donat and I collaborated with Duke University obesity medicine researcher Dr. Eric Westman and University of Michigan behavioral medicine researcher Dr. Laura Saslow to publish them in June of 2022. As a co-author of this paper, naturally I view its findings in a positive light. But having practiced psychiatry for more than 20 years, I can tell you that we never see results like this with standard psychiatric treatments. Clinical remission is rare. Most people leave psychiatric hospitals on more medication, and metabolic side effects such as weight gain are common. In this case, the remission rate was high, and instead of side effects, people were enjoying side benefits: healthy reductions in weight, blood pressure, blood sugar, liver enzymes, and triglycerides. This wasn't a randomized controlled trial, so we can't be certain that the ketogenic diet itself was responsible for the unprecedented improvements we reported. However, we believe it contributed considerably to these outcomes, as they would otherwise be difficult to explain. These patients had previously benefited very little from attentive outpatient care, multiple medications, and psychiatric hospitalization. The only difference between this hospitalization and previous hospitalizations was the addition of the ketogenic diet. These observations offer tremendous hope because they suggest that a ketogenic diet could bring significant relief to people with serious mental illnesses, regardless of the nature or duration of their symptoms. What is the ketogenic diet? The ketogenic diet is any way of eating that lowers insulin levels enough to burn fat and generate metabolically meaningful levels of ketones in the blood. Most experts consider metabolically meaningful ketosis to begin at blood ketone levels of 0.5 millimolar. I'll show you how to measure ketones in Chapter 18, but for now, just know that if your blood ketone level is at least 0.5 millimolar, you are in ketosis. There is no one-size-fits-all ketogenic diet plan because we are each metabolically different, and we have different dietary preferences. Some people think a ketogenic diet must be high in animal protein, contain lots of saturated fat, or completely exclude fruit. But these impressions are inaccurate. The ketogenic diet isn't a dietary pattern. So long as you achieve ketosis, you can follow any dietary pattern you like, including vegan, no animal foods, carnivore, no plant foods, and everything in between. There are even strategies such as calorie restriction and fasting that will shift your metabolism into ketosis while still allowing a fair amount of carbohydrate. But continuing strategies like those long-term would be unsustainable, so the ketogenic diets in this book will follow these widely accepted guidelines. Ketogenic diets should be very low in carbohydrate. The goal of any ketogenic diet is to lower insulin. Since carbohydrate is the macronutrient that tends to raise insulin the most, lowering carbohydrate is key. From a metabolic perspective, carbohydrate is the noisiest macronutrient you can eat. Ketogenic diets should be moderate in protein. Overeating protein can interfere with ketosis because protein stimulates insulin, although in most cases not nearly as much as carbohydrate does. However, protein is essential and it is the most important macronutrient in your diet, so undereating protein can be dangerous. Ketogenic diets should be relatively high in fat. The majority of calories in ketogenic diets come from fat instead of carbohydrate. Fat stimulates almost no insulin response. So, from a metabolic perspective, fat is the quietest macronutrient you can eat. Ketogenic diets exist on a spectrum from the relaxed, modified Atkins diet to the strict, classic ketogenic diet. The original Atkins diet, created more than 50 years ago by cardiologist Dr. Robert Atkins for weight loss, allowed for a gradual increase in carbohydrate over time and placed no limit on protein or fat, so it wasn't necessarily ketogenic. The modified Atkins diet caps carbohydrate at 20 grams per day and allows for liberal amounts of protein. The classic ketogenic diet, created by Dr. Russell Wilder in 1921 to treat children with epilepsy, places tight limits on both protein and carbohydrate. In between these two extremes are modified ketogenic diets, which allow for moderate amounts of protein. All three of these diets are very low in carbohydrate, but they differ in the amount of protein they allow. As protein decreases, fat increases to take its place. Combining carbohydrate restriction with protein restriction lowers insulin the most and raises ketones more robustly, making diets lower in protein more ketogenic than diets higher in protein. Think of protein plus carbohydrate as a ketone control knob. The less protein plus carbohydrate in the diet, the higher ketones will tend to be. I'll show you how to personalize your macronutrients in Chapter 18, but in most cases, lowering carbohydrate to about 20 grams per day is a good place to start. How does the ketogenic diet improve brain health? It may surprise you to hear that we know more about how ketogenic diets affect the brain than we know about psychiatric medications, because scientists and clinicians have been using and studying the ketogenic diet since 1921, decades before any psychiatric medication had been developed. Unlike medications, which target just one or maybe a few brain chemistry problems at most, such as the activity of a particular neurotransmitter, the ketogenic diet is a multi-purpose tool that addresses numerous underlying problems simultaneously. The ketogenic diet cools inflammation, bolsters antioxidant defenses, partially bypasses defects in damaged mitochondria, repairs and replenishes mitochondria, supports neuroplasticity, the creation of new brain circuits, resolves sensory gating deficits that cause hallucinations, rebalances glutamate, GABA, and other neurotransmitter systems, stabilizes brain cell networks, lowers sodium levels inside neurons, making them less reactive, and bridges the brain glucose energy gap. In short, the ketogenic diet stabilizes, protects, and energizes the whole brain, helping to restore peaceful equilibrium across multiple systems. By keeping your carbohydrate intake low, you also keep your blood glucose levels low and stable. No spikes or crashes in your bloodstream. Therefore, no spikes or crashes in your brain either. This alone goes a long way towards stabilizing brain chemistry. Lowering your brain glucose levels makes it less likely that you will produce advanced glycation end products, those sticky dysfunctional molecules we discussed in Chapter 6 that promote inflammation and oxidative stress throughout the brain. By keeping your insulin levels low, you allow your ketones to rise into the therapeutic range. If you have a history of insulin resistance, which most of us do, then your brain has trouble burning glucose for energy. Ketones cross easily into the brain and help bridge that energy gap, which many of my patients experience as a wonderful and welcome feeling. One gentleman in his 70s told me, "I feel like my brain just woke up from a long winter's nap." Phrases like mental clarity and calm, focused energy are ones I hear frequently. When I first tried a ketogenic diet myself back in 2012, I wrote in my food journal, "This diet is peaceful." I call my diet plans quiet diets, not only because they have the power to bring peace of mind, but also because that power lies not in the presence of special ingredients like superfoods or supplements, but in the absence of everyday ingredients that overstimulate, overwhelm, and aggravate our biology. Simplifying your diet by removing substances that interfere with your body's wisely designed systems allows your biochemical pathways to function at their best. Is the ketogenic diet safe? Most concerns about the ketogenic diet stem from the three ways in which these diets differ from those recommended by mainstream nutrition authorities. Criticism number 1. The ketogenic diet is dangerously low in carbohydrate. The USDA and many other nutrition authorities recommend we eat a diet containing 45 to 65% carbohydrate, despite the fact that the human body can make all the glucose it needs from fat and protein. Given that most of us have lost our ability to safely process large amounts of carbohydrate, one could argue that the USDA diet is dangerously high in carbohydrate. As UK-based nutrition researcher Dr. Zoe Harcombe testified to the British Parliament in 2019, "Don't base guidelines on the one macronutrient that we don't need and that diabetics can't handle. Criticism number 2. The ketogenic diet is dangerously high in fat. The ketogenic diet essentially replaces most carbohydrate calories with fat calories, bringing the fat percentage up to 70% or more. This worries those who believe that eating fat makes us fat. But you already know that insulin is what tells your body to store fat, and carbohydrate turns insulin up. This also worries those who believe that eating fat is dangerous because it raises cholesterol levels, clogs arteries, and causes heart disease. But you already know that insulin resistance is what sets the stage for inflammation and constriction of the coronary arteries. I'll address the cholesterol concerns in Chapter 11, but for now, suffice it to say that the type of fat you eat is far more important than the amount of fat you eat. Public health enemy number 1 is not high-fat diets. It is high insulin diets, and fat is the macronutrient that raises insulin the least. Criticism number 3. Being in ketosis is dangerous. Ketosis is a normal, natural, healing state that satisfies the brain's energy needs whenever we are not eating carbohydrates. Ketosis is not to be confused with diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a medically dangerous state of runaway ketone production that only occurs in cases of severe insulin deficiency, such as in type 1 diabetes, or when taking medications that increase the risk for ketoacidosis. The bottom line is that ketogenic diets are safe for most adults, provided they are properly constructed of nutritious whole foods, contain appropriate amounts of protein, that simple steps are taken in the beginning to minimize common discomforts that can occur as your body adapts to the diet, and that all medications and existing medical and psychiatric conditions are closely monitored by your healthcare team. The ketogenic diet for specific psychiatric conditions. The exciting emerging field of metabolic psychiatry hasn't yet produced large randomized controlled trials of the ketogenic diet for psychiatric conditions, but scientific interest in this area is exploding. At the time of this writing, there are clinical trials in the pipeline for anxiety, bipolar disorder, psychosis, substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, college mental health, and Alzheimer's disease. In the meantime, in addition to Dr. Donal's work, we have plenty of small studies, published case reports, and patient testimonials to educate and inspire us. If you have been living with any of these mental health conditions, following a ketogenic diet such as the plan I offer in this book may bring you much-needed relief. However, the ketogenic diet is a powerful metabolic intervention that requires careful planning and medical monitoring. So if you are considering this approach, please listen to Chapter 18 carefully first to learn how to use this strategy safely. Bipolar disorder. There is no clearer example of brain energy regulation gone haywire than bipolar disorder. People with bipolar disorder have sudden, unpredictable shifts in mood that include manic episodes, unusually high energy states that make it extremely difficult to sleep, and may also include euphoria, grandiosity, racing thoughts, pressured speech, hyperactivity, and other signs of increased energy. If manic episodes are severe, the illness is called bipolar I disorder. If they are mild, hypomania, the illness is called bipolar II disorder. Stretches of mania or hypomania are often followed by deep, severe depressions that can feel physically and intellectually paralyzing. One of the many problems with brain metabolism that can occur in bipolar disorder is difficulty transferring glucose fragments to the electron transport chain in engine M, where they can be efficiently churned into large amounts of energy. As a result, brain cells are left to rely mainly on glycolysis, engine G, the simple glucose chopping engine to burn glucose. But glycolysis alone simply can't generate enough power to support the hard-working sodium-potassium pumps needed to keep neurons primed and ready to fire. If energy supply is unreliable, those pumps will malfunction, causing neurons to either fire too much, mania, or too little, depression. You can think of this as a brain brownout. Without a steady supply of energy, neurons will flicker on and off at unpredictable times. There are 3 published case reports of women with bipolar disorder who found the ketogenic diet so helpful that they were able to successfully discontinue all mood-stabilizing medications, and formal clinical trials are already underway. Stanford University metabolic psychiatrist Dr. Shabani Sethi is conducting the first-ever clinical trial of ketogenic diets in bipolar disorder, expected to conclude in 2023. The second trial is being led by a team of scientists at the University of Edinburgh that includes Dr. Ian Campbell, who put his own bipolar disorder into long-term remission using a ketogenic diet. Ketogenic diet puts bipolar II disorder into remission. 7 years ago, a talented Scottish musician with bipolar disorder tried a ketogenic diet for weight loss. Dr. Ian Campbell is now one of the world's leading researchers in the field of metabolic psychiatry, specializing in the study of ketogenic diets for bipolar disorder. He shared with me, "With bipolar II, the depressive episodes are the worst part for me. At my worst, I'd experience long and unyielding depression for weeks and months that were physically and mentally exhausting. Performing even normal daily tasks was a struggle. At some point, I decided if I was going to be depressed for the rest of my life, I could at least be at a healthy weight. My diet was a typical standard American diet, including plenty of bread, cereal, pasta, and sugar. I noticed that around the time the depressions became more severe for me, I was putting on weight much more easily. So I tried a low-fat diet, but I felt terrible and found it impossible to sustainably lose weight. I learned about the Atkins diet and heard it worked well for weight loss, so I adhered to it strictly. My focus was weight loss. I hadn't heard about any benefits for mental health, but the plan, along with regular exercise, put me into intermittent ketosis. I started to notice a definite shift in my mental well-being. The first time, I was riding the bus on my way to work, and I became aware that I was experiencing something fundamentally different in my mind state. For the first time in 15 years, I felt the lights in my brain switch back on. It felt like I had a TV with the color contrast and brightness turned way down to where everything looked flat and dim. Now I was seeing bright colors rippling across the screen in subtle waves of positive emotion in response to normal daily events. I had no idea people generally experienced this in their day-to-day life. I had tried almost everything you could imagine over the years: medications, cognitive behavioral therapy, meditation, therapy, intense exercise, cold exposure, heat exposure, binaural beats, breathing techniques, countless supplements, vitamins, minerals, philosophy, travel, Camus, Kerouac, Nietzsche, briefly, you name it. I found small benefits in other approaches, but never true relief. Going into ketosis felt like switching on a backup power generator for my brain that I never knew I needed. It felt like it was addressing the root cause of my condition versus making small improvements in symptoms. When I experienced the mood stabilization and did some research, I learned about ketosis and so began to follow a full ketogenic diet. I tracked my ketones and mood around every 3 days over the course of a year and noticed that I got the best results when above 2 millimolar. When I am in established ketosis above 2 millimolar, my mood becomes stable. I have consistent energy, I sleep better, and I have a much clearer mind. Benefits seem to increase the longer I stay in ketosis. I've been in ketosis the majority of the last 7 years. When I keep to a regular schedule with good sleep and exercise, I find it easy to maintain the diet over long periods. The times it becomes more difficult are when a significant disruption occurs beyond my control, like heavily disrupted sleep, which can lead to food cravings. During these times, I have to have strategies to deal with it, such as pre-preparing keto snacks. My adherence is strongly motivated by wanting to stay well, and I get immediate feedback, mostly in the form of depression if I diverge from the diet even for a day. My thinking grinds to a slower pace, and my productivity drops dramatically. I can't make decisions, and everything feels overwhelming to me. The available literature indicates that bipolar disorder is as much a condition of energy dysregulation as it is a mood disorder, and there are now decades of research providing evidence of disruption of mitochondrial function and glucose metabolism in the brain. Ketones act as an alternative energy substrate for mitochondria in the brain, which may act to stabilize brain energy metabolism when glucose metabolism is compromised. Ketosis promotes stable energy in the brain while reducing hyperexcitability and protecting neurons from damage. If you were to design a treatment for bipolar disorder, it would be hard to think of a better combination of effects. When my symptoms of bipolar became noticeably worse in my teenage years, I also noticed significant weight gain, which was previously unusual for me. I think this indicated the onset of a systemic metabolic dysfunction. Bipolar is definitely a genetic condition, but environmental factors can trigger the onset of the illness. I think it's likely I would have experienced symptoms regardless, but perhaps if I had been aware of the problems with refined carbohydrates, I could have been well for longer and avoided more damage. I will need to stay on the diet permanently to not experience symptoms, so ketosis hasn't cured me. But it is an excellent treatment that allows me a quality of life I never would have experienced without it. I feel a responsibility to those with bipolar to let them know that this may be an option for them. I only wish I could have communicated this to people with bipolar in the dark ages of insulin shock therapy and lobotomy. The genes for bipolar are well preserved in the population, and I think that there are adaptive traits and rare mental capacities people with bipolar can use to contribute to the world. However, these same capacities make them particularly vulnerable to our unnatural modern environment. I believe this perspective is important to move the focus of treatment away from simple sedation to treatments which create an environment where people with bipolar can thrive. Ian Campbell, PhD, is the Bazooki Research Fellow in Metabolic Psychiatry at the University of Edinburgh Center for Clinical Brain Sciences. Major depression. In 2022, Virta Health, an innovative virtual diabetes care clinic based in the United States, published a study that included 36 patients with mild clinical depression. After following a modified Atkins diet for 10 weeks, more than half of the depressed patients no longer met criteria for depression. The average blood ketone level of all participants was 0.6 millimolar, and those who spent more days in ketosis, 0.5 millimolar or above, were more likely to experience mood benefits. One of the ways that ketogenic diets may help with depression is by cooling inflammation. For example, ketosis has been shown to shift microglia, the brain's immune surveillance cells, from a pro-inflammatory state to an anti-inflammatory state. Ketogenic diet dissolves decades of depression and anxiety. Eric had a happy home life and excelled in school, but by 3rd grade, he had become anxious and was teased for being overweight. He ate sugary cereals for breakfast and snacked on junk food after school. His mom cooked wholesome dinners, but these were always followed by dessert, and he snacked again before bed. By senior year of high school, he weighed 215 pounds. He lost 20 pounds before college by limiting himself to 3 meals a day, but was still eating junk. Still had some excess belly fat. And despite also taking up running, he developed high blood pressure in his mid-20s. Eric's first bout of depression occurred at age 30 and was mild. But his second episode, which occurred 7 years later, after his father passed away, was much more serious. He made a plan to commit suicide, even circling the date on his calendar. He said, "If I didn't feel better by then, that would be it." His doctor prescribed sleep medication, which did help, but some degree of depression persisted, and the obsessive anxiety he'd had since childhood was building like water coming to a boil. So at age 40, he started running marathons. He told me, "The running was treatment for me, and it helped, but I had to do a lot of it. I would feel horrible all day long, but then at 7 p.m., I would run 3 miles and would start thinking to myself, I don't want to die right now." But by bedtime, that good feeling was gone again. At age 45, he saw a psychiatrist who provided counseling and prescribed Lexapro, an antidepressant, both of which helped somewhat until age 55 when, after changing jobs, he experienced his deepest depression yet. He told me, "I had thoughts of suicide for most days for months on end." He had no energy to exercise, so his weight rose to 205 pounds. He was referred to a psychiatrist and recalls asking him, "I have a son in college, a good marriage, and my wife and I make good money. So why do I want to die?" After several years of antidepressant changes, he arrived at Effexor, which thankfully eased his depression, but also caused side effects. So, on the advice of a popular book, he adopted a vegan diet and started running again. He lost weight, and his mood improved somewhat, but the diet caused significant gastrointestinal distress, and it didn't completely resolve his depression, so he discontinued it after about 6 months. At age 56, he started a low-carbohydrate diet and felt so much better that he was able to slowly taper off all psychiatric medication. His triglycerides dropped from 170 milligrams per deciliter to 65 milligrams per deciliter. His hemoglobin A1C is normal at 5.4%. And at 6 feet 2 inches tall, his weight is a healthy 170 pounds. He's been following a low-carbohydrate diet for more than 6 years and remains symptom-free. "I have become a better version of me than I have been for my entire adult life. It's ridiculous how good I feel. It's a miracle, really. I wouldn't believe it if it didn't happen to me. I absolutely have a new life. I realize diet cannot fix every mental problem, but it 100% fixed mine." Schizophrenia. The first report describing the use of the ketogenic diet to treat mental illness was published in 1965. Clinicians at the Central Louisiana State Hospital placed 10 hospitalized women who were being treated for schizophrenia on a ketogenic diet for 2 weeks and noted significant improvement. The field then lay silent until 2009, when a 70-year-old woman who weighed 330 pounds was referred to Dr. Eric Westman's obesity clinic at Duke University. She also happened to have schizophrenia. Despite taking 2 antipsychotics, an antidepressant, and a sleep medication, she was plagued by chronic disabling symptoms, including paranoia, suicidal thoughts, voices in her head, and had been experiencing visual hallucinations of skeletons daily since the age of 7. Dr. Westman prescribed a simple modified Atkins diet for weight loss, and within 8 days, her psychotic symptoms began to improve. She was soon able to stop all psychiatric medications, and over time, she lost 150 pounds. At the core of this powerful antipsychotic therapy was a simple modified Atkins diet of beef, chicken, turkey, ham, fish, green beans, tomatoes, sugar-free beverages, and water. Years later, her psychotic symptoms were still in remission. Since that seminal 2009 case report, 5 additional case reports have documented substantial improvements in schizophrenia symptoms in response to ketogenic diets, and 3 clinical trials of ketogenic diets for schizophrenia are underway at Stanford University, University of California, San Francisco, and James Cook University in North Queensland, Australia. There are many ways in which a ketogenic diet may address root causes of schizophrenia symptoms. In addition to inflammation, oxidative stress, and brain brownout, problems which schizophrenia shares with bipolar disorder, people with hallucinations can have sensory gating deficits, meaning that the brain's natural ability to filter out and ignore irrelevant sounds doesn't work properly. In animal studies, the ketogenic diet completely restores healthy sensory gating mechanisms. Autism. Autism spectrum conditions, which occur in approximately 1% of children worldwide, are neurodevelopmental disorders that affect how people behave and interact with others, and are usually noticeable by age 2. 2 published case reports and 3 small clinical trials of ketogenic diets point to a variety of potential benefits for children with these developmental differences. One of these studies was a 6-month randomized controlled trial conducted in Egypt that divided 45 children into 3 groups: a balanced diet, a gluten-free, casein-free diet, casein is a dairy protein, and a ketogenic diet. Behavioral symptoms improved most in the gluten-free, casein-free group, whereas social, speech, and cognitive symptoms improved most on a ketogenic diet. The balanced diet resulted in no benefits. A common problem seen in autism is that mitochondria are less efficient at turning glucose into energy, partly because of a specific defect in complex 1, the main gateway to the electron transport chain. Ketogenic diets partially bypass that defective area by feeding more fuel molecules directly into complex 2, allowing damaged mitochondria to generate energy efficiently again. Ketogenic diets also improve the health of existing mitochondria and stimulate the production of new mitochondria. Binge eating and food addiction. Binge eating and food addiction are common concerns among my patients and cause a great deal of distress, a sense of powerlessness, and loss of self-esteem, not to mention significant weight gain. I view these conditions less as psychiatric disorders and more as the predictable result of ultra-processed foods specifically engineered to be addictive. But regardless of the underlying cause, I have found the ketogenic diet to be a powerful tool for addressing these concerns. In a published case series, 3 people with binge eating disorder, food addiction symptoms, and obesity responded beautifully to a modified Atkins diet that limited carbohydrate to a maximum of 30 grams per day, bringing binge episodes down from once or twice per day to nearly 0 episodes per week. 6 months later, their symptoms were still in remission, and they had lost 10 to 24% of their body weight. Ketogenic diets can help with food addiction and binge eating by stabilizing glucose and insulin levels, which in turn stabilizes hunger hormones and neurotransmitter systems. By reliably fueling cells in between meals, ketogenic diets reduce cravings and make it easier to go for longer periods of time without thinking about food. Ketogenic diet rapidly reverses food and mood issues. Deanna, not her real name, is a 64-year-old woman I consulted with who had lived with food addiction, binge eating, depression, and anxiety for 40 years. Her usual pattern was that she would begin snacking at 4 p.m. and then binge all evening long. She told me, "I know it's chemical in my brain. My brain feels hijacked. I've gained so much weight." She had tried many medications to try to suppress her appetite in the past, including Prozac, an antidepressant, Vyvanse, a stimulant, topiramate, a seizure medication that can reduce appetite, and naltrexone, a medicine that can reduce cravings for addictive substances by blocking opioid receptors in the brain. Before changing her diet, I asked her to write down all of her symptoms, which included feeling very irritated, feeling depressed, being non-productive, experiencing brain fog, wanting to sleep all day, feeling hopeless, wanting to isolate, not wanting to move her body, feeling like her bowels were messed up, having aching joints, gaining weight, and feeling she had no life at all. Deanna met full criteria for food addiction, scoring 11 out of 11 on the modified Yale Food Addiction Scale, full criteria for generalized anxiety disorder, scoring 19 out of 21 on the Generalized Anxiety Disorder Scale, and full criteria for depression as measured by both the Patient Health Questionnaire and the Beck Depression Inventory, on which her score fell into the severe depression range. All of these diagnostic scales are available to you in Appendix A of the accompanying PDF should you wish to evaluate yourself for these conditions. She was too depressed and overwhelmed to follow a ketogenic diet, which requires counting carbohydrates, so I asked her to start simple by eating only meat, seafood, poultry, and eggs without counting or tracking anything for the first week or two to get the ball rolling. Within 4 days, her blood ketone level was 2.1 millimolar, and by day 12, she no longer met criteria for any psychiatric diagnosis. She wrote, "After just 1 week of eating no carbs, there is a dramatic change emotionally, physically, my mood, and outlook on life. All of my symptoms become just the opposite. I become less irritated, and the brain fog lifts. My joints don't ache. My mood improves every day. No cravings for sweets. I just need to look at that list every day and remind myself that I don't want to go back." Substance use disorders. In a small randomized controlled trial, patients hospitalized for the management of alcohol withdrawal who were placed on a strict classic ketogenic diet experienced fewer alcohol cravings and required about 50% less oxazepam, a medication commonly prescribed to keep people safe and comfortable as they transition to abstinence. Blood ketone levels in this study exceeded 4.0 millimolar. Alcohol stimulates the activity of GABA, the brain's calming brake pedal neurotransmitter. So when people who have become physically dependent on alcohol stop drinking, GABA activity suddenly drops, upsetting the balance between GABA and glutamate, the brain's stimulatory gas pedal neurotransmitter. One of the ways ketogenic diets may help with alcohol withdrawal is by promoting a healthier balance between glutamate and GABA. Ketosis supports higher GABA activity, helping to fill the GABA gap created by the discontinuation of alcohol. Alzheimer's disease. The exciting possibility that ketones may help rescue starving brain cells has sparked dozens of studies of Alzheimer's disease in the past decade alone, including several human clinical trials. However, given that Alzheimer's is an advanced neurodegenerative disease, it is much more difficult to treat. Some studies use ketogenic diets alone, while others use supplements like ketone salts or medium-chain triglycerides, oils that the body converts quickly into ketones. There's more information about supplements in Chapter 18. We'll focus mainly on the diet studies here. A 2012 study conducted at the University of Cincinnati found that people with mild cognitive impairment, pre-Alzheimer's, who lowered their carbohydrate intake to about 35 grams per day, scored a little better on cognitive tests than those eating a standard high-carbohydrate diet. They also had lower blood glucose and insulin levels, naturally ate many fewer calories, and lost more weight. A 2017 study conducted at the University of Kansas found that people with early Alzheimer's disease who lowered their carbohydrate intake to about 45 grams per day and took MCT oil saw improvements on cognitive tests, and while the improvements were small, they were as good, if not better, than we typically see with Alzheimer's drugs like Aricept. The most rigorous trial to date was a 2021 randomized controlled trial conducted by researchers in New Zealand, in which a ketogenic diet was compared to a low-fat diet in patients with Alzheimer's disease. In this study, patients achieved higher ketone levels on average, just under 1.0 millimolar, than in other studies, and while they did score higher on tests of daily function and quality of life, their cognitive test scores did not improve. If ketones are supposed to help bridge the brain energy gap seen in Alzheimer's disease, why don't we see a more robust cognitive response to the ketogenic diet in studies such as these? Perhaps higher ketone levels would have led to better outcomes, but since Alzheimer's disease is a neurodegenerative disease in which a significant degree of damage has already taken place by the time symptoms become apparent, the sobering truth is that some of that damage may not be reversible. It is therefore important to identify and address metabolic dysfunction as early as possible. The ketogenic diet turns a brain around. Fran is a retired registered dietitian living in Colorado. About 20 years ago, at age 44, she slipped on the ice. Her head struck the ground, causing a neck injury and a concussion. She soon developed seizures and started struggling to remember things. She'd forget dates of important events, such as upcoming family weddings, hunt for hours for her car in parking lots, and get lost on the way to important work obligations. She was diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment and was prescribed lamotrigine, Lamictal, an anticonvulsant medication, to control seizures. Her cognitive abilities appeared to hold steady until her 60s, when she began noticing a bit more difficulty with memory and occasional trouble finding her words, but the changes were too subtle for her primary care physician to detect on a cognitive screening test. Then, at age 67, something scary happened. As Fran tells it, in April of 2021, my life was falling apart. After sewing for a lifetime, I could no longer figure out how to thread my machine. With both diagnoses of epilepsy and mild cognitive impairment 20 years ago, I knew there was a good chance I was progressing into a dementia. I saw my PCP about my condition. I scored miserably enough on a cognitive test for him to highly suspect that I had Alzheimer's type dementia, and he literally told me to go and enjoy the rest of my life. This was devastating. My cognition continued to get worse, and I didn't want to live that way. When her son reached out to me for advice, I offered to consult with her. Fran continues, my son was familiar with the utility of ketogenic diets for brain health, and we knew there was little promise in much else, so I started the ketogenic diet and implemented it to a T. And over time, I improved. I saw a neurologist who was thrilled that I was on the diet. He tested me while on the diet, and I scored 27 out of 28 on his test. He said, "It's time to take this tentative diagnosis off of your chart." I do know I was in serious trouble. Entering ketosis dramatically improved my condition to the point that I regained my ability to sew, to think more clearly, and to know that I can live like tomorrow is going to be great. At the time of this writing, Fran has been faithfully following a ketogenic diet for 22 months and maintains blood ketone levels at around 0.7 millimolar. She changed her diet as follows. Old diet, breakfast, raisin bran and skim milk, toast and butter. Lunch, burger or hot dog on bun, Diet Coke. Dinner, pasta meal with meat sauce, Italian bread, and salad. Snacks, crackers and cheese, peanuts, bread and butter. New diet, breakfast, None. She fasts from bedtime until noon. Late morning, coconut oil in beef broth. Late lunch, large salad, romaine, egg, tuna, cheese, nuts, bacon, with homemade keto poppy seed dressing. Dinner, cheese, bacon, and mushroom quesadilla on low-carb, sun-dried tomato tortilla. Beverage, diet tonic water with lime. Evening, coconut oil in beef broth. Snacks, pecans sautéed in lots of butter with erythritol brown sugar and a keto ice cream bar. After a lifetime of enjoying brownies made from scratch and home-baked artisanal breads, Fran is now thriving on a brownie-free, bread-free diet. When I asked her if she missed baking bread or having pasta for dinner, she became emotional and shook her head no. I sat in front of the sewing machine and couldn't thread it. I sat talking with my son and couldn't finish my sentences. I was scared to death. I believe I have the commitment to do this for the rest of my life. The fine print. Published cases and clinical trials don't yet exist for other psychiatric diagnoses such as attention deficit disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, and obsessive-compulsive disorder. However, since these are all brain-based conditions, and the ketogenic diet improves multiple aspects of brain health, there is reason to believe it has the potential to be helpful with all of them. As inspiring as these stories are, the ketogenic diet is not a mental health cure-all. However, in my clinical experience, most people with psychiatric conditions do benefit, and those who are able to follow the diet longer term are often able to reduce the number and/or dosage of psychiatric medications they take. There are also some who benefit from a ketogenic diet but continue to need full medication support. However, medication reduction isn't the only measure of success. Some of my patients have no interest in discontinuing medication because it allowed them to stay in school, kept them out of the hospital, or saved their life. Patients like these don't want to go off medication. They just want to feel better and be healthier on medication. One of the many side benefits of the ketogenic diet is that it can counteract some of the most common and concerning side effects of psychiatric medications, such as drowsiness, high blood glucose levels, high triglycerides, and weight gain. Even if the ketogenic diet doesn't make a big difference in your mental health, improving your metabolic health is a major victory in and of itself. There are certain situations in which ketogenic diets should not be used, and precautions to be aware of. See Chapter 18. But by and large, the ketogenic diet is a low-risk, high-potential benefit intervention well worth considering in the management of most mental health issues, from minor everyday concerns such as anxiety, irritability, and brain fog, to major mental illnesses. This is especially good news for people whose symptoms don't fall neatly into any diagnostic category. Beyond ketosis. Ketogenic diets support and stabilize brain metabolism with ketones, allowing the brain to operate more cleanly, smoothly, and efficiently. But optimal mental health is about more than just ketones. The nutritional quality of your diet matters too. If it's optimal brain health you seek, you'll need to do more than just energize your brain. You'll need to nourish and protect it as well. And this is where food choices come into play. Building your ketogenic diet from whole foods is key. But one of the best-kept secrets in nutrition science is that just because a food is whole doesn't necessarily make it healthy. So, which whole foods are best at nourishing and protecting your brain? Part 3. The whole truth about whole foods. Chapter 10. Meat, the original superfood. Red meat is not bad for you. Now blue-green meat? That's bad for you. Tommy Smothers. Meat is good for you. These 5 words represent a simple statement of biological fact. While there remain many unanswered questions about nutrition, the question of whether animal foods belong in the human diet is not one of them. Meat provides all of the macronutrients and micronutrients we need in their proper forms, including some that are difficult or impossible to obtain from plant foods. Unlike plant foods, meat contains no substances that interfere with our ability to absorb or utilize nutrients. Meat is easy to digest and supports healthy insulin levels without promoting blood glucose spikes. The human brain evolved to require animal source foods and therefore cannot develop or function properly without them. In a perfect world, this would be all anyone needs to know about meat. But given the widespread efforts to blame meat for everything from constipation to cardiovascular disease to cancer, it is not enough to explain the biological benefits of meat and let that information speak for itself. Alarming headlines proclaiming that meat, especially red meat, can harm us or even kill us, demand our attention. Therefore, I devote the lion's share of this chapter to the dismantling of popular anti-meat arguments so that you can see them for the paper tigers they are. All that said, we cannot turn a blind eye to the harsh realities of industrialized meat production systems. While I am convinced by the science that meat belongs in a brain-healthy diet, I am equally convinced that the way many animal foods are produced is inhumane and unhealthy for animals, humans, and the planet. So we will wrestle with these problems as well in search of a better way forward. Before we begin, please note that throughout this chapter, I will use the word meat to refer not only to red meat, mammal meats such as beef, lamb, pork, venison, and bison, but to all types of animal meat, including seafood, poultry, and organ meats such as liver. What is red meat? Let's start with the basics. What is the difference between red meat and white meat? Red meat simply contains more heme iron, which happens to be red. We've been taught to think of all mammal meat as red meat and all poultry meat as white meat, but this is biologically incorrect. All animals, including fish and birds, need heme iron. Therefore, all animals contain at least some red meat. Heme is a ring-shaped protein with a hole in the middle to hold a metal ion. When the metal in the middle happens to be an iron atom, the molecule is called heme iron. Heme iron empowers the hemoglobin in blood to carry oxygen around the body, the myoglobin in muscles to store oxygen for exercise, and the mitochondria in cells to usher electrons through the electron transport chain, helping turn food molecules into energy. Hard-working, slow-twitch muscles, particularly those used for endurance, including muscles needed to simply stand up all day, think cow, need lots of oxygen to sustain their activity, so they are richer in heme and therefore redder in color. Although in sedentary or very young animals, these muscles will be more pink than red. Fast twitch muscles that power short bursts of activity are used less often and contain less heme, so they're paler in color. Most fish don't need strong muscles because water supports their weight, so their flesh usually isn't red, except in their fins and tails. But fish that swim fast for long distances, such as tuna and shark, have more red meat. The breasts and wings of chickens and turkeys are light meat because they don't fly much, but their legs and thighs are dark meat because they stand and walk on them all day. The meat of nearly all other birds, including ducks, geese, and ostriches, is red. In fact, ostrich meat contains just as much heme iron as roast beef. Are humans supposed to eat meat? Human beings are omnivores, meaning we are biologically equipped to consume both plant and animal foods. It is impossible to know precisely which foods our prehistoric ancestors consumed and how often, but logical to assume that they chose from whatever plants and animals were seasonally available in their geographic location. For example, humans living near the equator would likely have had year-round access to abundant plant foods such as tropical fruits and starchy root vegetables, as well as a great diversity of mammals, birds, reptiles, insects, and aqueous creatures. Whereas humans living near the North Pole would have had year-round access to Arctic mammals, birds, and ocean creatures, but little to no opportunity to consume plant foods of any kind for most of the year. While there is passionate debate about how much meat our prehistoric ancestors ate, most paleontologists agree that meat was an indispensable part of their diets. Chimpanzees, our closest primate relatives, supplement their mostly plant diet with insects and small amounts of meat. Does this mean that we humans could also thrive on a mostly plant diet? Our prehistoric ancestors began evolving away from chimpanzee ancestors more than 6 million years ago. The earliest evidence that pre-humans used tools to prepare meat dates back more than 3 million years, and evidence that meat had become an important staple food dates back 2 million years. It was at around this same time that our ancestors' abdominal cavities began to shrink, likely reflecting the shortening of the digestive tract. Extracting nutrients from plant foods is a slow process that requires the assistance of bacterial fermentation in the lower intestine, whereas meat is efficiently digested by stomach acid and gut enzymes, then absorbed in the upper intestine. As a result of eating more meat and fewer plants, our overall gastrointestinal tract became smaller than that of chimpanzees. Our colons are less than half the size, and our small intestines nearly twice as long. The human brain eventually grew to become 3 times larger than the chimpanzees, and its cerebral cortex, the layer responsible for complex thought, contains twice as many cells. Some scientists argue that eating meat made us human, meaning that meat allowed us to devote less energy and bodily real estate to the long intestinal tract needed to process high-fiber, high-plant diets, so that we could invest more energy in developing our uniquely oversized brains. Meat is nutrient-rich. As our ancestors' diets shifted to include more meat, it became much easier to provide the brain with the macronutrients and micronutrients it needs, particularly in early childhood, when the brain is rapidly growing and developing, but the digestive system is still rather small and immature. This is because, contrary to popular belief, meat contains more nutrients per ounce than plant foods and is easier to digest. Macronutrients. Protein. Animal foods provide the highest quality protein available. All meat proteins are considered complete proteins because they contain adequate amounts of all 9 essential amino acids. Fat. Animals store most of their energy as fat, so all meats contain fat, whereas plants store most of their energy as starch, so most plant foods contain less fat than most animal foods. All animal fats naturally contain a mixture of saturated and monounsaturated fat, as well as vital polyunsaturated fatty acids, PUFAs, including the omega-6 arachidonic acid and the omega-3 fatty acids EPA and DHA. DHA is particularly precious because it's very difficult for us to make from plant fats, and because it plays indispensable roles in brain development, brain energy production, and brain cell communication. Carbohydrate. All non-dairy animal foods are naturally extremely low in carbohydrate, but they're not carbohydrate-free. For example, nearly all cells contain DNA and RNA, which contain sugar backbones. All cell membranes contain fatty molecules with sugary components, glycoproteins and glycolipids. And muscle and liver cells contain glycogen. Liver contains 1 gram of carbohydrate per ounce. Nevertheless, the amount of detectable carbohydrate in non-dairy animal foods is extremely low compared to plant foods, and nutrition labels tend to list the carbohydrate content of most non-dairy animal foods as 0 grams per serving. Cholesterol. Since all animal cells need cholesterol, all animal foods contain cholesterol. Plant cells need cholesterol too, but they use a different kind. However, there are certain animal foods that are particularly high in cholesterol. Liver is rich in cholesterol because the liver is where most of the body's cholesterol is manufactured. Glandular organ meats, such as pancreas, kidney, and sweetbreads, are higher in cholesterol because glands produce hormones, which are made from cholesterol. The brain houses 20% of the body's cholesterol because the myelin sheaths, which insulate its electrical circuits, are full of cholesterol. The cholesterol in milk is there because the growing baby calf needs it to build new cells. And egg yolks contain concentrated cholesterol because the growing baby chick needs it to build new cells. We'll explore the controversy surrounding cholesterol in the next chapter, but suffice it to say for now that cholesterol is good, and human life would be impossible without it. Micronutrients. We think of colorful fruits and vegetables as nutritional powerhouses teeming with vitamins and minerals, but a little-known nutrition science fact is this. Just because a food contains a nutrient doesn't necessarily mean our bodies can access it. Many plant nutrients suffer from poor bioavailability, meaning that they come in forms that are harder for us to use. That naturally occurring substances within plants, called anti-nutrients, interfere with our ability to extract, absorb, and/or utilize them. For these reasons, while certain fruits and vegetables can be excellent sources of vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin K1, and folate, vitamin B9, meat is a superior source of all other essential nutrients, including several nutrients that plants don't contain at all. Surprisingly, it is theoretically possible to obtain all of the vitamins and minerals we need from animal source foods alone, particularly if some organ meats are included in the diet. For example, liver is an excellent source of vitamins A, D3, E, K1, K2, and folate, which are harder to obtain from muscle meats, particularly if they are lean. Animal foods are low in vitamin C compared to many fruits and vegetables, but they do contain enough to meet our daily requirements if not overcooked. In fact, there is enough vitamin C in fresh meat to treat and prevent scurvy. The most challenging nutrient to secure from non-dairy animal foods is calcium, since most of it resides in bones, shells, bone marrow, and blood, which most people do not consume. Only animal foods contain true vitamin A, retinol, which is at least 12 times more bioavailable than the beta-carotene in plants. Meat is an excellent source of every B vitamin, including B7, which plants contain very little of, and B12, which plants do not contain at all. Vitamin D3 from animal foods is easier to use and store than D2, the form found in mushrooms and yeast. Only animal source foods contain the MK4 form of vitamin K2, which is easier to absorb and is the form used by the human brain. and only animal foods contain the long-chain polyunsaturated fatty acids EPA, DHA, and arachidonic acid. In your accompanying PDF, you will find a table comparing the nutrient availability of plant and animal foods. Meat contains all the nutrients we need in their most bioavailable forms without interference from anti-nutrients. The brain evolved to require meat, and meat allowed the brain to evolve. Our digestive system is engineered to process meat. How, then, has this nutritious whole food that we've been consuming since time immemorial come to be viewed as responsible for the meteoric rise in chronic physical and mental illnesses that began only in the past century or so? Why are we told that animal foods in general, and meat in particular, especially red meat, endanger our life and health? Our complicated relationship with meat. Our uniquely sophisticated cerebral cortex blesses us not only with exceptional intelligence, but also with a conscience. Our ability to empathize with other species can make it psychologically uncomfortable to kill and eat other creatures, particularly those with whom we most closely identify, our fellow mammals. This spiritual connection to other mammals may help to explain why red meat in particular is so often the focus of anti-meat sentiment. Are some species more precious than others, and if so, where do we draw the line? Author Lierre Keith, who followed a vegan diet for nearly 20 years and suffered serious mental and physical health consequences as a result, wrestles with this question in her book, The Vegetarian Myth. From a colony of ants unintentionally crushed while tending her organic garden, to the billions of creatures in the nourishing topsoil below who would go hungry without natural fertilizer, she realized that growing her own food involves the lives and deaths of countless others. She writes, "We are dependent on a million different creatures, most of them invisible to our eyes, all of them doing the work of producing or degrading that we cannot do. For someone to live, someone else does indeed have to die. To reject one is to reject the other because there is no way out. Where was I going to draw the line? That was the question, my personal, political, spiritual agony. Mammals, fish, insects, plants, plankton, bacteria? I have my answer finally. I'm not going to draw a line. I'm going to draw a circle." However, our inescapable dependence on the death of others doesn't mean we can't work harder to minimize unnecessary suffering and improve the quality of their lives. The industrialization of our food supply, which began in the mid-1800s, led to the mass production of animal foods at the expense of animal and environmental health and welfare, raising important ethical concerns that understandably have turned many away from meat. Another consequence of the Industrial Revolution was urbanization. Migrating to cities physically and emotionally separated a great many of us from the land and animals that feed us. However, vegetarianism in certain circles existed long before industrialization, dating back more than 5,000 years to ancient Egypt, where it was believed that abstaining from meat would improve chances of reincarnation. Western monastic traditions forbade the consumption of four-legged animals. Hinduism holds cows sacred, and Buddhism teaches nonviolence toward all animals. These philosophies are grounded in moral or spiritual beliefs, and some of them remain influential even today within these religious communities. It wasn't until the 1800s that health-related arguments about the biological benefits of eating plants and the medical dangers of eating animals first appeared in the narrative. Interestingly, this line of reasoning originated not from scientific or medical institutions, but from Western religious ideologies. According to research conducted by Belinda Fettke, an expert in the history of the origins of plant-based dietary trends, it was the temperance health reformer movement that began sowing the seeds of vegetarianism in the Western Hemisphere. Historian Margaret Puskar-Paszewicz described the temperance health reformers of the early 1800s as blending religion, science, philosophy, and politics to establish a scientific rationale for vegetarianism. The cause was soon taken up by the fledgling Seventh-day Adventist Church, most notably by its co-founder Ellen G. White, who reportedly experienced more than 2,000 visions from God during her lifetime, many of which informed her dietary teachings. The Seventh-day Adventist Church, through studies it conducts at Loma Linda University and practices it promotes through the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, has since become a powerful voice in the science and politics of nutrition, influencing research and policy worldwide. Unlike spiritual arguments, which tended to influence only certain segments of the population, fear of chronic disease transcends religion and culture, and therefore proved to be a more effective way to change hearts and minds. Even the medical and scientific communities have been moved by these baseless claims, as evidenced by the tremendous resources they have invested in studying the potential connection between meat and declining public health. If modern scientific inquiry in this field has been largely driven by a religious hypothesis rather than a biological hypothesis, it helps us understand why hundreds of research papers attempting to find evidence that meat endangers our health have been written, and why they repeatedly come up empty-handed. Dismantling anti-meat arguments. When I advise patients to include some meat in their diets to nourish their brains, their most common concern is that it will be bad for their hearts or that it will cause cancer. Rest assured that what is good for the brain is good for the heart and vice versa. Remember, it would not make sense for each of your organs to require a different diet. All of your cells require the same basic nutritional care. Does red meat cause heart disease? The idea that red meat could cause heart disease is based primarily on two bodies of research. One, nutrition epidemiology studies seeking associations between red meat consumption and heart disease risk. And two, randomized controlled trials, RCTs, exploring how red meat affects blood levels of LDL, the so-called bad cholesterol, and or triglycerides, fat in the bloodstream. As for the first category of research, we've already discussed how nutrition epidemiology studies are unhelpful, but it may further put your mind at ease to show you how trivial the epidemiological associations between red meat and heart disease tend to be. Researchers at Cornell University and Northwestern University pooled 6 epidemiological studies totaling nearly 30,000 people and published a meta-analysis of their findings in the Journal of the American Medical Association in 2020. They determined that eating 2 additional 4-ounce servings of unprocessed red meat per week was associated with an increased risk for cardiovascular disease of only 3 percentage points, reporting this increased risk as a hazard ratio, which you can think of as the relative risk, of 1.03. We learned in Chapter 3 that a relative risk of less than 2.0 is considered too small to be meaningful, and a relative risk of 1.0 represents no increase in risk at all. As for randomized controlled trials, there has actually never been a human RCT designed to explore whether eating red meat causes or worsens heart disease, perhaps in part because conducting such a study would be logistically very difficult. Instead, we have dozens of RCTs exploring whether eating red meat raises LDL cholesterol and triglycerides, because higher LDL and triglyceride levels have long been thought to increase risk for cardiovascular disease. These studies have yielded inconsistent results, with findings pointing weakly in different directions. Despite the fact that studies haven't yet been able to demonstrate a connection between red meat and heart disease, many researchers continue to believe it exists, even when the ingredient within red meat thought to be most dangerous for the heart, saturated fat, has been exonerated. The saturated fat hypothesis. For decades, we were told that beef was dangerous because the saturated fat it contains was supposed to drive our blood cholesterol levels up, force cholesterol into our coronary artery walls, and cause heart attacks. Fortunately, this hypothesis is dying a long overdue death. In 2020, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology published a state-of-the-art review of saturated fats and health, concluding that there is no robust evidence that current population-wide arbitrary upper limits on saturated fat consumption in the United States will prevent cardiovascular disease or reduce mortality. According to a comprehensive 2015 report published by the Credit Suisse Research Institute, the wealth of scientific evidence does not support the idea that saturated fat increases risk for heart attacks, writing, "We cannot find a single research paper written in the last 10 years that supports this conclusion. On the contrary, we can find at least 20 studies that dismiss this hypothesis." In 2021, an international panel of experts, which included 2 scientists who had previously served on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, or DGAC, reviewed the evidence and came to a similar conclusion. Multiple reviews of the evidence have demonstrated that a recommendation to limit consumption of saturated fats to no more than 10% of total calories is not supported by rigorous scientific studies. Even though the saturated fat hypothesis is melting away under the heat of scientific scrutiny, the belief that red meat causes cardiovascular disease continues to beat on in the hearts of many researchers, leading some to start pointing the finger at a different molecule within red meat, carnitine. The carnitine hypothesis. Be forewarned that the hypothetical line connecting carnitine to heart disease involves taking a long and winding detour through a completely different molecule called TMAO. So, we'll need to familiarize ourselves with both of these molecules first before we try to understand the convoluted argument against carnitine. Carnitine is a vital nutrient that transports fat molecules into the mitochondria to be burned for energy. It is so important that if you don't eat enough of it, your body goes out of its way to make it from scratch. Red meat contains far more carnitine than white meat because red muscle fibers use more energy. Plant foods happen to be extremely low in carnitine because they primarily burn carbohydrate for energy, not fat. Most of the carnitine in meat is absorbed by the small intestine. If any carnitine remains unabsorbed, it will work its way down to the colon, where certain gut bacteria can turn it into a foul-smelling gas called TMA, trimethylamine. TMA wafts into the bloodstream and enters the liver, which converts it into TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, an odorless substance that is safely eliminated in the urine. In a 2013 study that has since been cited in more than 2,500 scientific papers, a group of Cleveland Clinic researchers reported that carnitine promotes atherosclerosis, hardening of the arteries, by demonstrating the following. 1. Extremely high doses of L-carnitine, a poorly absorbed form of carnitine not found in meat, caused atherosclerosis in mice that were genetically altered to easily develop atherosclerosis. 2. When human subjects were fed steak, plus moderate amounts of this same form of poorly absorbed carnitine, some of them produced TMAO in their urine. 3. When the aforementioned atherosclerosis-prone mice, who are missing a gene required for normal cholesterol processing, were fed TMAO supplements, they excreted less cholesterol in their cage droppings, suggesting that TMAO had trapped some cholesterol in the body. This led researchers to theorize that TMAO could lead to heart disease. Note that these experiments do not show that carnitine, TMAO, or red meat cause heart disease in humans. They don't even show that steak alone causes high TMAO levels in mice or humans, because no steak-only experiments were conducted. All we can glean from this study is that people who want to avoid high TMAO levels should not take L-carnitine supplements with their steak, and that mutant mice develop atherosclerosis when they are fed unnaturally high quantities of a form of carnitine not found in meat. This study has led to additional research since, but as the science currently stands, the red meat leads to high TMAO, leads to high cholesterol, which leads to heart disease notion, remains an unsubstantiated and rather far-fetched hypothesis that nevertheless continues to be circulated as a reason to eliminate red meats from our diets. Who says meat causes cancer? In 2015, the World Health Organization, or WHO, issued a 2-page report titled The Carcinogenicity of Consumption of Red and Processed Meat, warning that processed meat causes colorectal cancer in humans and that red meat probably causes colorectal cancer in humans. This document made headlines worldwide and continues to have a major impact on how people think about meat and health. But there are good reasons to question its findings. The epidemiological evidence against meat. The vast majority of the studies used to prepare the report were nutritional epidemiology studies. The WHO looked at more than 800 epidemiological studies of red and processed meat and cancers of all kinds, but ultimately chose to focus only on colorectal cancer and put forth 56 human studies as informative on this topic. Of the 29 studies of unprocessed meat, 14 suggested an association with higher risk for colorectal cancer, and 15 did not. As we've learned, for epidemiological studies to suggest a cause and effect relationship between things like meat and cancer, their findings must be consistent. Since half of these studies pointed in one direction and half in the other direction, there is no reason to suspect that there is any connection between unprocessed meat and cancer worth exploring further. Of the 27 studies of processed meat, 18 suggested that processed meat was associated with a higher risk for colorectal cancer in humans, and 9 did not. While these findings are less conflicted, even if valid, they can only suggest a hypothesis about unprocessed meat that then must be tested in clinical experiments. The experimental evidence against meat. The WHO cited only 6 experimental studies in their report, despite many more being available. 3 were rat studies, 2 were human studies, and 1 was a rat-human study, a study of rats and humans, not of hybrid rat-human creatures. Red and processed meat in rats. In these 3 studies, rats were first injected with powerful carcinogenic chemicals, azoxymethane or dimethylhydrazine, to hasten the cancer development process. Yes, you heard that correctly. Next, they were fed various high-meat diets for 100 days, roughly equivalent to 10 human years. Some experimental diets contained adequate calcium, and others were intentionally depleted of calcium. Calcium protects cells against heme iron, which researchers believed to be the cancer-promoting ingredient within red meat. Lastly, they examined colon biopsies for potentially precancerous changes. only the calcium-deficient diets led to potentially precancerous changes in rat colons. And even in these cases, no rat developed cancer. The authors of one of these studies begin their paper with this striking statement. In puzzling contrast with epidemiological studies, experimental studies do not support the hypothesis that red meat increases colorectal cancer risk. Among the 12 rodent studies reported in the literature, none demonstrated a specific promotional effect of red meat. Translation? They found a dozen rodent experiments testing the relationship between red meat and colon cancer, and none of them had turned up any evidence against red meat. Surprisingly, not a single one of these 12 red meat is fine rodent studies were included in the WHO report. Selectively choosing to include studies that support one's arguments while excluding those that don't is known as cherry picking. Processed meat in humans. In the only study of processed meat in human subjects, researchers fed 17 healthy men a low antioxidant, low calcium diet that included 6.3 ounces of poorly packaged ham for 4 days. Ham was left unwrapped in the refrigerator for 4 days to allow exposure to air, which causes oxidative damage to the product. Then, rather than subject volunteers to colon biopsies, they tested their urine and stool for 5 different colon cancer biomarkers, substances that may be linked to colon cancer risk. 3 of these biomarkers remained unaffected, including the 2 that are considered the most reliable indicators of colon cell damage. But 2 increased: ATNC, apparent total N-nitroso compounds, and TBARS, thiobarbituric acid reactive substances. The relevance of both of these biomarkers to colon cancer has since been called into question by scientists, but nevertheless, when calcium and vitamin E were added back into the diet, these biomarkers did not rise in response to the poorly packaged ham. Translation? Eating badly packaged ham for 4 days in a row probably won't increase your risk for colon cancer. If your diet contains adequate calcium and vitamin E, eating badly packaged ham definitely won't increase your risk for cancer. Unprocessed red meat in humans. The WHO report cited only 2 studies of unprocessed red meat in humans. Both were randomized controlled trials, but they were small, brief, and poorly designed. In the first study, researchers asked 23 volunteers to eat a low-fiber diet containing red meat for 4 weeks, and then to continue on that same diet supplemented with fiber for an additional 4 weeks. These unfortunate individuals then underwent rectal biopsies to look for a particular type of colon cell mutation called O6MEG. Following the low-fiber phase, researchers did find more of these mutations, but when participants switched to the fiber-supplemented phase, this rise in mutations was completely blocked. It was later determined that O6MEG is a poor biomarker for colon cancer risk because this type of mutation naturally occurs so frequently in cells throughout our bodies that we produce an enzyme whose sole responsibility is to repair it wherever and whenever it occurs. In the second study, 25 volunteers were confined to a metabolic ward and fed one of 3 diets for 10 days each: a vegetarian diet, a low-fiber diet containing red meat, and a high-fiber diet containing red meat. Following these interventions, researchers measured ATNC levels, the same biomarker used in the processed meat study, and looked for a different colon cell mutation called O6CMG. Once again, the low-fiber red meat diet appeared worse, resulting in higher ATNC levels and higher numbers of O6CMG mutations than the vegetarian diet. However, the low-fiber meat group was fed refined carbohydrates in place of high-fiber foods. And if any volunteer in any group started losing weight, they were fed buttered marmalade bread to restore their original weight. We are not told which volunteers received these additional treats nor how often. Therefore, we don't know whether it was the presence of red meat, the presence of refined carbohydrates, and or the lack of fiber that made the diet containing red meat appear worse than the vegetarian diet. Furthermore, it has since been discovered that our enzymes can also repair O6-CMG mutations, so these mutations may also be unreliable biomarkers for colon cancer risk. There's a recurring theme here. Researchers attempting to tie red meat to health problems change so many dietary variables that they hopelessly obscure the effects of red meat itself. Yet, when their overly complicated meat diets perform worse in their studies compared to meatless diets, they tend nevertheless to conclude that red meat must have been the culprit. It is remarkable the lengths some scientists go to in an attempt to demonstrate that red meat is unhealthy. Why not simply compare a diet containing red meat to a diet that is otherwise identical, but that replaces red meat with a comparable quantity of tofu, white meat chicken, or fish? Given that at least 768 of the 800-plus epidemiological studies were either not worth considering or found no association between meat and cancer, that the majority of existing rodent studies found red meat did not promote colon cancer, and that none of the 6 experimental studies cited was designed in a way that can tell us whether red meat increases our risk for colon cancer, perhaps a more responsible and accurate title for the WHO report would have been, "Vast majority of studies find no relationship between red meat and cancer." In November 2013, 23 cancer experts from 8 countries gathered in Norway to examine the science related to colon cancer and red and processed meat. They concluded the interactions between meat, gut, and health outcomes, such as colorectal cancer, are very complex and are not clearly pointing in one direction. Epidemiological and mechanistic data on associations between red and processed meat intake and colorectal cancer are inconsistent, and underlying mechanisms are unclear. Translation: we don't know if meat causes colorectal cancer. In 2022, a review of the nutrition epidemiology studies concerning unprocessed red meat and cancer found that the associations were too weak and insufficient to make conclusive recommendations about unprocessed red meat. Miscellaneous meaty myths. Defending claims against red meat is like playing whack-a-mole. As soon as one myth is bludgeoned back into its hole, another one pops up. Let's briefly review some of the more common ones. Myth number 1. Seeing red, heme iron causes cancer. In addition to its indispensable roles in animal biology, heme iron is what gives red meat its characteristic color and flavor. This is why some plant-based meat manufacturers spent $75 million mass-producing genetically modified leg hemoglobin, a form of hemoglobin located in the roots of soy plants, and inserting it into their patties. So, could heme iron be the cancer-causing culprit lurking within red meat and within bogus burgers? Not according to this 2015 statement written by David Klurfeld, Ph.D., the USDA's National Program Leader for Human Nutrition and one of the authors of the WHO report. He wrote, "There is no data that normal levels of heme in the human intestine contributes to any harm." Myth number 2. Charred meats cause cancer. Charring or wood-smoking meat produces polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs, and heterocyclic amines, HCAs, both of which have been shown to cause cancer in lab animals. The doses of these compounds that cause cancer in animals are 1,000 to 100,000 times higher than doses found in human food. Studies in humans are limited to epidemiological studies, and even these have been inconclusive. HCAs can form not just in red meat, but in any protein-rich food, including fish and poultry. PAHs form in all plant and animal matter that has been exposed to high heat processing, such as smoking, toasting, and frying. They are found in a wide variety of foods, including grilled vegetables, cocoa products, and milk powder, but are extremely high in flour, cereals, and breads, which can contain levels more than 1,000 times higher than in cooked meat. Myth number 3. Nitrates and nitrites in processed meats cause cancer. Nitrates and nitrites are used in the production of processed meats like bacon, salami, and ham. However, they are also found naturally in many plant foods, often in very high amounts. Nitrates and nitrites themselves have not been shown to cause cancer. However, they can react with other protein fragments to form nitrosamines, chemicals that can cause cancer in laboratory animals. The majority of the nitrates in the typical Western diet come from vegetables. So if nitrates and nitrites do increase cancer risk, then not only should we limit our intake of processed meats, but we should also limit our intake of high nitrate vegetables, such as spinach and celery as well. Ounce for ounce, spinach contains more than 80 times more nitrate than hot dogs do. And celery powder is so high in nitrates that manufacturers use it to create processed meats, often proudly advertising that their products have no nitrates or nitrites added except for those naturally occurring in celery powder. Myth number 4. Meat causes constipation. Meat is the easiest food to digest. Stomach acid, intestinal enzymes, and bile efficiently dismantle its proteins into individual amino acids and its fats into fatty acids, and absorption into the bloodstream is virtually complete, with little to no waste left over to eliminate. If you're skeptical, simply ask yourself these 2 questions. 1. Have you ever seen pieces of undigested meat or fat leaving your body? And 2. Have you ever seen pieces of undigested plant foods, such as broccoli, nuts, seeds, peas, or corn, leaving your body? Myth number 5. Meat causes obesity. Obesity is a relatively new epidemic, whereas meat is an ancient food. High insulin levels turn fat storage on, and low insulin levels turn fat storage off. Any way of eating that causes insulin levels to run too high too often can lead to unwanted fat gain. And the most powerful stimulators of insulin release are foods high in refined carbohydrate ingredients such as sugar and flour. In a classic 1997 study measuring the insulin response to 38 foods, beef's insulin index was 51. The insulin index of bananas was 82. White bread's insulin index was 100, strawberry yogurt's was 115, and jelly beans topped out at 160. Myth number 6. Meat causes diabetes. Type 2 diabetes is a disease characterized by persistently high blood glucose levels. Meat is incapable of causing unhealthy elevations in blood glucose because it is extremely low in carbohydrate. In the same 1997 study just mentioned, the glucose response to beef was by far the lowest of all 38 foods tested. It's when you fry it in batter, douse it in sugary barbecue sauce, or tuck it into a sandwich that you may run into problems. Myth number 7. Meat causes hypertension. A 2020 meta-analysis of 36 RCTs found no effect of red meat on blood pressure in comparison to other protein sources. A recent study by Dr. David Unwin and Associates found that patients prescribed a low-carbohydrate diet that allowed meat experienced significant reductions in blood pressure and reduced need for blood pressure medications. Since high insulin levels raise blood pressure and cause the kidneys to retain more sodium, lowering insulin levels by lowering carbohydrate intake could explain these benefits. Myth number 8. Meat causes kidney disease. The number one risk factor for kidney failure is hyperglycemia, and the number two risk factor is hypertension. Healthy kidneys can safely handle diets very high in protein. What they are not designed to handle is high glucose levels and high blood pressure. A 1930 study of two men who ate a 100% meat diet for a full year revealed no signs of kidney problems whatsoever. And modern studies of bodybuilders eating between 2.2 and 3 grams of protein per kilogram body weight per day, about 3 times the recommended amount, for months at a time, found kidney function remained normal. Myth number 9. Meat causes gout. Gout is a type of arthritis often accompanied by high blood levels of a metabolic waste product called uric acid, which can crystallize in the joints and cause pain. Once called the ailment of kings because it mainly afflicted those who could afford to eat rich diets, gout now affects more than 40 million commoners worldwide. For centuries, it was believed that gout was caused by high meat intake, but there is no experimental evidence of this. It has recently become clear that, like so many other chronic diseases, gout is rooted in insulin resistance, which impairs the body's ability to eliminate uric acid. Myth number 10. Meat causes inflammation. Molecules within red meat accused of causing inflammation range from saturated fat to polyunsaturated fat, arachidonic acid, an omega-6 fatty acid found only in animal foods, to heme iron, to Nu-5-GC, a signaling molecule found only in mammal meat. However, a 2020 meta-analysis of 24 human RCTs concluded that red meat has no effect on blood markers of inflammation, whereas it is well established that hyperglycemia leads to inflammation throughout the body. What if eating meat breaks your heart? The hypothesis that meat is dangerous to human health has driven a long and passionate hunt for evidence against meat that has thus far come up empty-handed. Rather than acknowledge that the trail has gone cold, this hypothesis continues not only to survive, but to thrive, suggesting that it is far more likely to be rooted in feelings than in facts. As a psychiatrist, I have a healthy respect for feelings and understand that we humans make some of our most important decisions with our hearts rather than our minds. However, I also think everyone deserves to know the facts so that they can weigh them against their feelings and make their own decisions based on what matters most to them. Real problems with meat. I am at peace with the biological fact that all life must consume life, but the way we treat the animals we depend on for food matters. Industrialized mass meat production systems create very real and deeply disturbing problems for the health and welfare of animals, humans, and the environment. Factory farmed fats. Just as is true for humans, when animals spend time in nature and eat a species-appropriate diet, their brains and bodies thrive. Whether factory-farmed, humanely raised, or wild, animal foods remain the safest and most nutritious foods we can eat. But that doesn't mean these animal foods are equally healthy. And one important difference would seem to be the quality of their fat. When an animal such as a hen, which is supposed to eat a diet of grass, wild plants, insects, and other small creatures, is forced to eat a vegetarian diet based on corn, soy, and synthetic supplements, her body composition will change. She'll still be able to turn the starch into the glucose she needs, and she'll still be able to turn the proteins into the amino acids she needs, although she'll need a little help from amino acid supplements to provide those lacking in a vegetarian diet. But what will she do with all of the extra linoleic acid? A hen's natural diet would provide omega-3 PUFAs, EPA and DHA from grass, and plenty of saturated and monounsaturated fats from critters, but very little linoleic acid. Whereas approximately 50% of the fat in corn and soy is linoleic acid. Hens raised on corn and soy, or even worse, soybean oil, which is extremely high in linoleic acid, are forced to store this fragile fatty acid in their fat cells. The same is true of pigs, cows, and other livestock overfed on grains and legumes. And the same is true for us when we consume the meat or eggs of these animals. If you recall from Chapter 6, excess linoleic acid has a tendency to degrade into toxic byproducts with potentially negative health consequences. Ethical and environmental concerns. Problems with factory farming of animals go well beyond how animals are fed, to how they are housed, treated, medicated, and slaughtered. These serious concerns have led some to recommend that we stop eating animals altogether, but it would be just as illogical to recommend that we stop eating plants altogether because pesticides and monocrop cultures endanger human health, destroy small animals and animal habitats, and damage topsoil. Industrialized plant and animal food production systems disrespect human employees, devalue consumer health, and pollute the land, water, and air. These are grave issues that we must face if we are to find a healthier, more sustainable way forward for plants, animals, and the environment we all share. It isn't the animals themselves that are damaging our health and our planet. It's the way we humans manage them. As dietitian founder of the Global Food Justice Alliance, Diana Rogers, and paleo diet expert Rob Wolf write in their book, Sacred Cow, The Case for Better Meat, it's not the cow, it's the how. Reviewing the science of the environmental impact of meat production and proposing solutions is beyond the scope of this audiobook. However, my understanding is that if animals are raised well, they can be an indispensable part of the solution to many of our environmental and health challenges. The arguments in this arena are complex, nuanced, and well worth deeper exploration. So I refer you to the work of Nicolette Hahn-Nyman, the author of Defending Beef, The Case for Sustainable Meat Production, and Righteous Pork Chop, Finding a Life and Good Food Beyond Factory Farms. As an environmental lawyer and beef rancher who followed a vegetarian diet for much of her life, she is uniquely qualified both to prosecute the case against factory farming and defend the importance of thoughtfully managed animals to human and planetary well-being. While it is always best to choose meats from wild animals or animals that have been humanely raised, allowed ample access to the outdoors, and fed a species-appropriate diet, these options are not always available and can cost more. Explore local farms or farmers markets where you can purchase meat as a part of a community share, or order shipments of frozen animal foods from sustainable sources. Do the best you can, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. When purchasing conventional animal foods in an ordinary grocery store, your best bet, according to Nicolette Hahn-Nyman, is beef. She writes, unlike other animals raised for meat, milk, or eggs, beef cattle start their lives with their mothers, nourished only by nursing and grazing. Most will continue to live in herds on pasture or rangelands for the first year of their lives. Regardless of how they are raised after that, they will never be confined to buildings or kept continually on concrete. The more I saw and learned about the way dairy cows, pigs, chickens, turkeys, and egg-laying hens were raised, the more I regarded beef cattle as having the best lives of all animals in agriculture. Calling for the end to production of these exceptionally nutritious, metabolically friendly whole foods is not the answer to our global mental health crisis, and in fact could easily make it worse. The challenge before us is to grow the foods we need in ways that minimize pollution, and respect soil, ecosystems, and animals. Meat is good for you. Meat, including red meat, seafood, and poultry, is a time-tested, evolutionarily appropriate whole food for human beings. There is no evidence that red meat or any other type of meat is harmful to any aspect of human health. Meat contains every nutrient we need in its proper form without anti-nutrients. Meat is good for gut health because it is non-irritating and very easy to digest. How to nourish, protect, and energize your brain with meat. Choose healthy meats. Whenever possible, choose meats from wild animals or animals that have been raised humanely, allowed ample access to the outdoors, and fed a species-appropriate diet. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. If you can't access or afford high-quality meat, just do the best you can. It doesn't have to be red meat. It is very important to include some meat, seafood, poultry, and/or eggs in your diet, but you do not need to eat the meat of mammals, red meat, to meet your nutritional requirements. Shellfish, fatty fish, egg yolks, duck, and poultry liver are all examples of highly nutritious alternatives to red meat. Eat fresh. Choose unprocessed, fresh, or freshly frozen meats whenever possible. Don't fear natural animal fats. Fattier cuts of meat are more flavorful, more nutritious, and often less expensive. Unfortunately, pork and poultry fat from conventionally raised animals can be high in linoleic acid. Cook gently. Don't overcook meat, as this will damage nutrients and flavor. Trim away any burned or blackened areas of meats grilled or cooked at high temperatures. And finally, don't overdo it. Overeating protein can promote higher insulin levels and even slightly higher glucose levels in some people. Refer to Chapter 17 to estimate your daily protein requirements. In my research, I have yet to find a credible, plausible health argument against including meat of any kind, red or otherwise, in the human diet. In fact, quite to the contrary. No other food group is nutritious enough, safe enough, or geographically accessible enough to recommend as the healthy foundation of the optimal human diet. If you could only afford to buy food from one food group, this would be the one to prioritize.